welcoming you to the third day of K. Raj Centenary celebrations hosted by the Center for Development Studies. We have two guests in the session, Professor Geeta Sen, Honorary Distinguished Professor and Senior Advisor, Ramalingaswamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health, Public Health Foundation of India, Bangalore, and former Professor of IIM Bangalore. And Professor Pranab Bardhan, well-known writer, Emeritus Professor, University of California. I invite Professor Geeta Sen to take over the stage and chair the session.
Can you hear me? Yes. So good morning, everyone, and thank you to the very kind introducer who I was pushing away from the morning, saying no need for introductions, we'll just start. Today's a long day with many sessions, so we're going to try and keep to time as best we can. So this morning's session is, of course, the special lecture that Professor Pranab Bardhan is going to give. Professor Bardhan is absolutely no stranger to CDS, has been here many times, and has his presence and speaking on campus is always fascinating because he always has something new and different to say. So I look forward very much to his session. Let me give a very brief introduction, even though, as I said, he needs no introduction really. He's Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at UC Berkeley. He studied at Presidency College, Kolkata, Cambridge University, and has been on the faculty, as you probably know, of the ISI, of MIT, of the Delhi School of Economics, before joining UC Berkeley. He's also been visiting professor or fellow at many places, including Trinity College in Cambridge. His work involves both theoretical and field studies research on rural institutions in poor countries, on the political economy of development policies, and international trade. And as a part of his work, a part of his work is in the interdisciplinary area of economics, political science, and social anthropology. His latest book, and of course he has many books to his credit, his latest book titled A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries, was published by Harvard University Press in 2022. And I suspect that some of what he is going to be saying to us today will draw from that book, but I'm sure also that he has many new things that he would like to add. I'd just like to say that we also have the pleasant good fortune of having Pranab on twice today, because towards the end of the day, he will be in a conversation with Professor Sudipta Mandal on his own biography, which should also be fascinating. We do not have a discussant for this morning's session, so I will make a few opening remarks for the discussion after Professor Bardhan has spoken, and then throw it open to to all of you. Professor Bardhan?
So I'll go this.
So you can move this with this. Huh? I think you can move this.
That's okay. I'll do this. Good morning. Thank you, Geeta, first for those generous remarks. And thanks to CDS, Viramani, the director, and others who invited me to give this lecture in memory of somebody whom I not merely respected a great deal like most of you, he was a good personal friend. And in fact, in the evening session tonight, what Geeta referred to as the session on my memoir, I'm going to speak about some anecdotes in memory of K.N. Raj. But let me start by saying just one or two sentences right now that Raj, as I said, was a good personal friend, but he was also a great academic inspiration for me. When I started my research in Cambridge, England, I did my PhD, and also after that I moved to MIT. Around that time I was doing primarily theoretical mathematical work. But then I soon got dissatisfied with just doing that. I decided to come back to India and do empirical work. And in my empirical work, two persons, both South Indians, who became very important in my research here in India. One South Indian was T.N. Srinivasan, who was my colleague at the Indian Statistical Institute. He made me familiar with the intricacies of Indian statistical system. But an even greater inspiration for empirical work for me was Raj. Raj was not, unlike T.N., was very deeply involved in the statistical systems. Raj inspired me in two ways, primarily two ways. One is, I knew of hardly anybody who had a larger vision of the structure of the Indian economy, combined with a grasp of the micro realities of India's various Indian economy's various diversities. This combination is extremely rare. As I said, I'll talk more about Raj this evening, but let me just say that I tried to pay tribute to Raj when I became my friend also of CDS, T.N. Krishnan, invited me to be one of the co-editors of a volume of essays in memory of Raj. But as I said, I'll come back to Raj later this evening. I hope and I believe that the topic that I've chosen would have interested, the topic is in front of you, I presume, would have interested Raj. Essentially, it's about distributive conflicts arising from inequality and insecurity around the world. And this, many people have linked with the democratic erosion in different parts of the world, including, of course, India. This book that Geeta referred to, 2022 book, is largely on that subject. The first part of the book is on why is it that the poor in many countries and the working class in many countries seem to be turning right rather than left. And that is the main question behind the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is what can be done, whatever little that can be done to think about on those. That's the main book. I'll drop partly on that book, but not much. I'm going to go into essentially on income inequality, first income inequality. There's a great deal of work in the last few years on inequality, particularly led by my friend Thomas Piketty, who's now become very famous for his work on inequality, but that group primarily focuses on the top 1%, top 0.1% vis-a-vis the rest, etc. Less often discussed is the even more widely prevalent decline in labor share over the last 4 decades or so. And I've cited some references. One is from an IMF report for the whole world on labor share decline, and the other more recently in an overview piece in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I cite the data on decline of labor share in this period, 1980 to 2019. Now, of course, everybody will recognize that labor-saving technology and globalization are clearly important in driving this decline in labor share. And there's some empirical work going on right now. A very recent research in South Korea showed that software and labor are strong substitutes. But what I'm going to emphasize is more the institutional or organizational factor facilitating in this systematic weakening over time of labor organizations. Trade unions losing existing members and unable to attract sufficient numbers of new ones now have their back to the wall. And I'm going to discuss the various factors behind the weakening of labor movements, and then talk a little bit of, in that uphill battle, what little we can do. I will talk the global context, but I will primarily emphasize 2 countries. One is India, the other is the United States. Both of these countries, unlike some European countries, for example, business happens to be very much anti-labor, anti-union, quite hostile to labor organization in both United States and India. Persistent, well-funded campaigns by business interests against unions and their capture and use of media to this effect, resulting in the shrinking of organized workers' traditional rights and domain. In India, particularly the very large rise in contract labor without benefits, without security, etc. What some of these business people who are hostile to labor organization quite often ignore, that some of the labor problems they face are preventable if active unions were there. So take the recent 4 years back, recent case of worker unrest taking a violent turn in December 2020 in Wistron's iPhone assembly factory near Bangalore. This was a factory that employed about 2,000 regular employees along with 7,000, look at the numbers, 2,000 regular employees and 7,000 contract workers. And there was no labor union. So it's not that the labor union was fomenting trouble. It's quite often the absence of labor union causes problems. The grievances that inflamed many workers included inordinately delayed payment of wages, an extension of workday to 12 hours without much notice or consultation. Several states in India have now officially introduced 12-hour work days. I was remembering as a student reading Marx's Capital Volume 1, where he writes pages against the 12-hour work day. That's in the middle of the 19th century. And we are now today in the 3rd decade of this century. We are introducing 12-hour work day in some states, not centrally yet. In India, in recent years, there have also been a substantial dilution, if not outright gutting, of workplace safety regulations, and many attribute the recent rise in industrial accidents to this wanton deregulation. in rich countries, informal, unorganized labor is growing with increasing numbers of what are called gig workers, platform workers. In India, it's also growing, but that's a small part of the total labor force. Our labor force is what? About 480 million. In poor countries, the number of workers in the traditional informal sector, not to speak of informal workers in the formal sector, far exceeds the number of formal workers. And that is the major Achilles heel of labor movement. So there are many reasons for weakening of labor organization. One major is labor fragmentation of various kinds, by skill, by gender, by production sector. For example, traditionally, labor organizations used to be stronger in the manufacturing and transportation sector. Now the service sector is rising, and that is labor organization all over the world is less strong in the service sector compared to the manufacturing and transportation sector. By organizational unit, whether labor organization is on a sectoral basis or farm by farm, because the more farm by farm, the weaker is the bargaining power of workers. There's also this Ghent system in some West European countries. The Ghent system, if you're not familiar with it, is that in those Western European countries which have the Ghent system, the state's payments of welfare is through the trade unions. So that makes the trade unions quite influential for the workers. In most other countries, the Ghent system is not there. And of course, what I just referred to, the formality, informality. In a country like India, where more than 80% of workers are either informal workers or informal workers in the informal sector, but also informal workers in the formal sector, and many of them are in self-employment. So this kind of labor fragmentation weakens for a long time the labor movement. Now, one of the things that come to my mind, how to relieve this fragmentation. You cannot do away with it totally, but you can introduce some universal programs which will appeal to different fragments of labor, which are at the moment fragmented. So for example, programs in which all sections of the workers are likely to be interested, not just the small formal workers organizations. Formal workers organizations are weak now, but much better off. Informal workers, there are very few organizations. So for example, universal access to vocational training program and active labor market policies. Active labor market I put under quotation because that's the name given, and the most successful case is in Denmark, where they have a very active program of reskilling, retraining. So you lose your jobs in one sector, and then the government takes active policy in retraining you, reskilling you, so that you become ready for another sector or another farm. Very few countries, certainly not United States, certainly not India, we have active labor market policies. But some countries have very active vocational training programs. So for example, the university where I teach, University of California, is associated with a community college system. Community college system in which a large stream after graduating moved to the vocational stream. The most successful vocational case is Germany. We talk about it sometimes in India, but very little is done. Universal healthcare, which is something that will be both formal, informal workers will be interested in. Today in India, we do not have universal healthcare. We are more following the American system of healthcare through private insurance, etc., less so of universal healthcare. A neighbor, forget about Britain and France, Germany. A neighboring country has universal healthcare, Thailand. And I think there's a lot to learn how the Thailand has introduced reasonably successfully universal healthcare. Universal access to child care, which will certainly will have an effect on the gender segmentation of labor movement. Similarly, universal access to community kitchens like Amma Kitchen in Tamil Nadu, Indira Kitchen in Andhra Pradesh, and so on. And something that I have discussed in other places, universal basic income. Universality of benefits as a right to every citizen is also a way of reducing political clientelism, or having welfare policies as gifts of political leaders, sometimes along with their photographs. I already said the service sectors, labor organizations are usually weaker, but now there are attempts all over the world. I give some example. US has a large service sectors union, SEIU, both in US and Canada. And then I give example from UK and Ireland. Germany's IG Metall, Europe's largest industrial union, now opening up for self-employed workers. The Independent Workers Union of Great Britain trying to reach out to gig workers. The major informal workers union, they call it a trade union, is SEBA, Self-Employed Employees Women's Association. And there was, during the pandemic, there were some app-based transport workers. Now, to me, trade unions are not just institutions for wage bargaining or improvement of work conditions. They also act as a cultural anchor of shared identity, solidarity, and pride in work. Their cultural and sports events used to serve as arenas for this kind of sharing of solidarity. The unions in many countries used to tame and transcend the parochial, sectarian, or ethnic communal passions. With their weakening, there is a cultural void filled in by various kinds of populist demagogues. In my book, A World of Insecurity, I discuss in great detail how it's not just economic insecurity, but cultural insecurity that is behind workers turning right rather than left. Now, trade globalization, of course, has a negative effect with increasing importance of branding and marketing privileges, that privileges capital and skills. Effects of financial globalization also weaken labor bargaining power, for the simple reason is that capital can wield a threat which labor cannot. Capital says, if you don't agree to our terms, we'll go somewhere else. Labor cannot make a similar credible threat. So, from the labor's point of view, there is a strong case for restrictions on international movement of capital, not just from the point of view of financial stability. Usually, people who argue against free movements of international capital, they usually talk the financial stability argument, but I think there is also a labor bargaining power argument. The other thing that weakens labor movement, of course, increasing corporate concentration in both these economies that I mentioned, in India as well as the United States, a very large rise in corporate concentration. In India, there are some studies. Viral Acharya has estimated that in the period 2016 to 21, the concentration, particularly in the top 5 business groups, has increased sharply, largely through mergers and acquisitions. these big 5 conglomerates are in over 40 NIC 2-digit sectors, covering much of the non-financial corporate India. What are these 5 conglomerates? Most of you know, it's Ambani, Adani, Aditya Birla, Tata, and Bharti Mittal Group. Now, what this leads to, this concentrated capital, to an academic economist, what it does, it strengthens monopsony in the labor market. In the buying of labor, there is increased monopsony, and that gives capital a much stronger hand in bargaining with labor. In developing countries, such monopsony is exacerbated by geographic segmentation of labor markets, localized monopsony. So improvement in physical infrastructure can relieve some of this geographic segmentation. Unfortunately, there is very little work on empirical work on labor market monopsony in India, particularly in the non-farm sector. I remember many decades back when Ashok Rudra and I carried out village surveys in a random sample of 110 villages in West Bengal. We showed a great deal of evidence, observational evidence, of rural labor market fragmentation through various degrees of labor tying by employers using interlinked relations with employees in concomitant credit and land tenancy relations. More recently, Karthik Muralidharan and co-authors, this just come out, 2023, there's an experimental evidence that in undivided Andhra Pradesh, the NREGA, by providing a minimum wage, weakened the monopsony power of landowners in the whole area, drove up market wages and employment. Because when there's monopsony, if you raise the wage, it helps not merely wages but also employment, unlike in competitive models of labor markets. And they found that wage and employment gains were significantly higher in villages with higher land concentration, in other words, where monopsony is stronger. In my work with Ashok Rudra, we also found, we did a separate survey in 80 villages in West Bengal, separated into 5 clusters of neighboring villages. We found significant evidence of territorial segmentation of the rural labor market and of limited labor mobility even within adjacent territories. But these are all rural labor markets. Very little work in India, and this, anybody is looking for a research topic, to me, it cries out to be done. Labor market monopsony in the non-farm sector in India. I already did this. For the United States, there's a great deal of work going on labor market monopsony. One of my Berkeley PhD students, Suresh Naidu, and his co-authors estimate that employer monopsony power reduces labor share by 22% in their work on the United States. In a work on Peru, the authors estimate that in markets with higher employer concentration, workers on average receive only 57% of the value of the marginal product of labor, almost half of the value of the marginal product of labor. Even in the United States, there's some estimate that labor on average receives only about 65% of the value of their marginal product of labor. These are all indicators of labor market monopsony. Now, of course, in terms of remedies, we have to try to reduce the corporate concentration. The big obstacles, of course, corporate lobbies. But also, there is a change in the way we look at monopoly. In most textbook economics, where they talk about anti-monopoly, they look at it mainly from the consumer price point of view. But that's not the only point of view, which is important today to emphasize. This concentration also affect the labor market. The reason I'm emphasizing this is very simple. Think of Google or any of the big tech firms. Often they will say, oh, we are not hurting consumer price. Google search is free. It's not actually free. When we search something, we don't pay a price. We are paying a price. As somebody said, in such cases, you are the product because we are giving our information free to these companies, which these companies then sell to the advertisers. So it's not free, but we give up as if it's free. But even if you forget that, it's not consumer price alone. So Google is quite anti-union. And this kind of concentration of power helps them weakening labor movements. And today we have to think about, there's a whole legal literature on this. How to look at antitrust, not just from the consumer welfare. We have to look at all the stakeholders, and the stakeholders include workers. And I find in Indian judicial decision, no judge ever discuss the labor point of view. At most, they will discuss the consumer point of view. And then, of course, other policies like substantial taxation of capital, wealth, capital gains. So, for example, wealth tax and inheritance tax in India is exactly zero. Capital gains tax there is, but much lower rate than in the United States, where rates are lower than in Europe. At a time when most of the data will tell you wealth inequality in India is galloping. Now, there are some examples of labor-friendly capitalism, particularly in two ways. Giving workers more ownership rights, like in worker cooperatives. The only major example in India is Lijjat Papad. It's a rare example of successful, large-scale women worker cooperatives in India. The other way, one is giving workers more control within the farm, this way worker cooperative. The other is giving workers a larger voice in the governance of the capitalist-owned farm. Such labor voice can increase the say of workers in the farm's decision to outsource or relocate. If you get a seat for labor at the table of international negotiations on trade and investment rules, currently the corporate lobby and their expensive lawyers largely shape these rules, then you can slightly influence globalization to be somewhat labor-friendly. Not at the moment, except in countries where labor has a voice in the main governing bodies. I'm going to give the example. Another very important is we sort of naturally assume that technology is labor replacing. It is usually, but it need not be. It depends on the decision which way you move R&D of the farm, the research and development. In India, as it is, R&D is a very small percentage, even compared to China and South Korea. But more than that, since labor does not have a voice in the governing bodies, the decision of R&D is entirely taken by the business. Labor has no representation. Also, most of the economist discussion is on the rate of innovation. To me, equally important is the pattern of innovation, which direction you move your research and technology. Very recently, the 3 Nobel Prize winners in economics, Acemoglu and Johnson, 2 of them, have a recent book come out called Power and Progress. They show, for thousands of years of technology, they show every time that technology goes towards labor replacing when labor is weak. Labor representation in the corporate decisions is weak. And they give you hundreds of examples of that in that book. This is a very good book, if you ask me. Already in the United States, unions are demanding a greater role in regulating artificial intelligence. Because artificial intelligence, if you leave it things to the business, it will go in the labor replacing direction. But that's not necessarily the case. Asimoglu, for example, have written articles to show that it is possible to turn AI into a labor absorbing direction, provided labor has a voice in the organization of research and development. Voice of labor in corporate governance can also influence the nature of corporate donations to election funding and lobbying with the legislators, which currently serve mainly the interests of capital and, of course, subvert democracy. And this is particularly important in the two largest democracies in the world, United States and India. Corporate lobby, and labor has no voice in where the donations of the company will be made. The country for which we have a great deal of empirical evidence and therefore lots of studies on the effects of labor voice in corporate governance is Germany, in the form of works council, or more generally what is called co-determination or shared governance. Large amounts of observational data show that this has positive effects on productivity, trustful industrial relations, and improvement in channels of information flows between management and workers. It is also, by the way, it shows in German corporate bodies, women are better represented than in many other rich countries. It's because labor has a voice, a very important voice. In many large German companies, half the seats in the top corporate body are by worker representations. So that makes a big difference. Recently, that was observational data. There is an article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics 2021 provide quasi-experimental evidence on positive effects of shared governance in Germany on productivity. Most of the work is on Germany because that's where it's been going on for quite some time, so there's a lot of empirical data on productivity without negative effects on profitability, raising of finance or farm turnover. Some indirect evidence also there is of larger horizon of the farm in matters of investment or stake in the farm. In the US, the corporate sector is much too short horizon, next quarter's profit statements, whereas in farms or companies where labor is represented, usually there's some evidence that they take a longer view, longer horizon. Very little sign of these kinds of new thinking in Indian discussion on labor issues. Social democracy, unlike democratic socialism, wants to use the innovative dynamics of capitalism, but that at the same time tries to modify it in a labor and environmental friendly direction. It's a delicate balance to democratize the sphere of capital without quashing its dynamism. Scandinavian, and people might say, well, if you make it labor friendly, innovation will decline. I'm saying no. If you look at the data on innovation, for example, WIPO, which is World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, they publish every year annual ranking of countries by innovation. And if you look at this, top 10 or top 5, you will see the top 5 include social democracies like Sweden, like Finland, like Germany. So it's not, United States is there, but there's social democracies that is also in the top 5. So it is wrong to think that if you make it labor friendly, it's going to reduce the innovation. One difference in the US, innovations are disruptive innovation, whereas in countries like Germany, it's incremental innovations. This is the last slide. Much too often, in countries like the United States and India, there's an attitude among businessmen to consider labor mainly as a disposable cost factor, and in the context of their low bargaining power, to squeeze the maximum out of them. Ultimately, this hurts both capital and labor. In fact, Robert Solow has a short, slim volume called labor market as a social institution. He says that labor market is not like other markets, like vegetable market. Labor market is a social institution. If you involve labor in the production process, it's going to help capital as well. So there are many ways you can make capitalism labor friendly, which will not necessarily reduce profits, long-run profits of capitalists. So I say it is possible to save capitalism from myopic capitalists. As Marx mentioned in volume 1 of Capital, he talks about saving capitalism from capitalism. You might say, why do you want to save capitalism? Our task is to dismantle it. My answer to that is, if you can dismantle capitalism without damaging the innovations and dynamism of capitalism, you have my best wishes. But until then, I will keep on what can we do modifying the existing system. Let me end there. Thank you.
Friends, you'll agree we've had a keynote address that is full of ideas, wide-ranging, and lots of food for thought. Just a smattering of a few things that Pranab said which caught my attention. The importance of looking at labor's share in national income, and the fact that that has been declining. The systematic weakening of unions, about which I'm sure we'll have more discussion. The relationship between this and firm concentration. The idea of labor market monopsony in the non-farm sector, and the importance of studying that more carefully. The importance of not just the rate of innovation, but the direction of innovation. The role of cooperatives, workers' councils, and other mechanisms for labor self-organization. And interestingly, the question of the relationship between innovation and labor organization, which of course he challenges sort of the given wisdom that the more labor organizes, the less innovation you're likely to get. And quite rightly so, I think, because there's almost no evidence that suggests that that is the case when one looks at it. I just want to make 3 points and to raise a question from that. The first is, this is a global phenomenon, as you said. All of these things that we are seeing in different and varying ways are present in many, if not all, countries. So what is the role of the whole neoliberal globalization and privatization in driving us in this direction? We know that India enthusiastically adopted this from 1991, but actually the process began before that. It has gone hand in hand with the reduction of social protection, big social protection systems like MRNEGS, and so on, even as we hear noises about how we are doing better for different subgroups and subcategories. The huge increase in inequality of both wealth and income, as well as unemployment and underemployment, which is related to the process of globalization, and fourth, the reduction of environmental controls. And we see this all over the place. The second and related set of questions I think that your presentation raises is the role of the state. And by state, I don't mean state versus center, but the role of the state. I remember when I was on the mission steering group for the National Rural Health Mission, in its halcyon days, let me call it, I was very critical of a number of the things that NRHM was doing, but I also could see in which ways it was actually moving us forward. And I remember sitting in this apex body of NRHM with one of the members who was an MP, RJD MP, who was pleading the case of giving Ashas at least a minimum wage, rather than calling them volunteers, paying them on a piece rate basis, and pretending that they are really not workers at all. Of course, that went nowhere. But those were days of the UPA government. So part of the process of what we've seen happening to labor predates 2014 and was well on the way at that time. And you could not get, and I'm reminded a little bit of yesterday evening's discussion by Sanjay Baru about the nomenclatura and the bad bureaucracy grabbing power. I'm not sure I agree entirely with that, but certainly it's the case that the bureaucracy was by and large in favor of this kind of breakdown of public sector labor formalization. And if we remember that the public sector, small as it has been in terms of employment, if we think about aggregates, has still been a very important trend setter. And the trends that have been set in the public sector have been anti-labor for quite some time, and predate and include across the spectrum. Of course, more recently, we've seen the so-called labor reform and the 3 labor laws that have come in, one of which at least is definitely responsible for the crass lengthening of the working day that you spoke about. 12-hour days were not legal in this country not very long ago, certainly not in the formal sector. And the role of quote-unquote labor reform in doing this simply cannot be minimized. The third is related to the rise of unemployment and underemployment, is this whole business about which we have a thriving argument, public argument going on right now, which has to do with female labor force participation. And the fact that after a period of, you could almost say, trend improvement in female labor force participation from the 70s to late 60s, 70s, and part of the 80s, we saw a plummeting in female labor force participation, followed more recently by official figures that suggest that there has been a significant upturn. And yet, if we look at that upturn, it's a bit ironic for me as a feminist political economist who has been speaking about the importance of recognizing women's work and of including all types of women's work, including unpaid domestic activities in our counting of work, to then have it turned around and be told that, see, female labor force participation rate is going up because now we've started counting unpaid family labor. But unpaid family labor is not what it needs to be counted and addressed, but it's not what we're looking for in terms of women's empowerment, autonomy, and improvement in working conditions. The third point I wanted to make is, and it's related very much to the question of labor reform, is the role of the Bretton Woods institutions. I think they bear a huge responsibility in this regard. The consistent pushing of this kind of quote-unquote labor reform in country after country after country is not accidental and has happened. And again, there's so many ironies here when you look at it particularly from the perspective of women workers. When I get the IMF producing data which says, oh, if you only included all of women's work, your GDP would go up by billions and trillions. Excuse me, you're doing a lot of things to reduce GDP by billions in a lot of countries where you're imposing austerity policies. So please don't use women's work and women's labor force participation as your fig leaf for so-called labor reform. But I think that these three elements are critical. And I just want to end with a question, because you had a lot of suggestions for the kind of mobilization, organization, transformations that could possibly happen. In India, as we know at this point, the big moves in this direction are towards caste-based organization and caste-based coalitions. And I wonder if you would care to comment in this regard in terms perhaps of your own earlier work, or maybe some of your current thinking in terms of what the potential is there for turning around some of these directions. So having said this, let me perhaps I'll take it from there. Let me call for questions, and I know there's 1,000. Jos. And if we can keep questions and remarks short, we'll get as much. We have about 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Professor Burden, Pranav, can you hear me?
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but can you keep it close?
Okay. I'm Jose, A.V. Jose. You probably would know me. It's a wonderful idea that you espoused, that workers can be empowered through institutional safeguards championed by the unions. Allow me to say that greater part of my working life I spent on that subject, and at the end of the day drew very pessimistic conclusions. Therefore, allow me to share some misgivings within a very short time. First, about the declining labor share, not just during the 4 decades. It has been a historically continuing process. Of course, there are gradations. Among the skilled categories, you still have a higher share of labor income, but historically declining irrespective of the gradations and categories. But coming to the role of unions, let me say they were entities created by the manufacturing societies. They came into provenance emerged as representatives, voices for safeguards of the workers. But that process was curtailed with the diminution of the industrial society. The moment you had a diversified labor force with varying skill gradations, unions decline started. More importantly, the ascent of the services industry. It has always been beyond the reach of trade unions. You mentioned the service sector, inter-union, all those points. But then let me say, the institutional safeguards created by them, basically implying the universal basic endowments, access to education, healthcare, childcare, all those things. But let me say they were institutions created in the golden age after prosperity came into being. And there the unions played a role. But then we are far remote from that. The prospects of the informal workers, certainly there is a limited chance of the formal sector. Okay, sorry. We are far remote from that, and it's very unlikely that we are going to move in that direction which you espoused. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos. Sudipto.
You mentioned about what's been going on in the rural sector, fragmentation, the importance of Manrega and so on. Recent field work that some of us have been doing, we find that there's a enormous phenomenon going on of migration, temporary migration from rural to urban areas, which is just not being caught by our data systems. Because these workers are neither being sampled at the origin nor at the destination, because usually they're in their work sites, just living in some shanties nearby, mostly going to construction from backward states to places like Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Gurgaon, etc., etc. The question I had is the macroeconomic sort of analytical one, that given the weakening of labor, and globally it's not just in one or two countries, and therefore the declining share, you come back to that original internal contradiction of capitalism via the inadequacy of the market. And I just wondered what thoughts you had on that, where will this go? I mean, you keep on reducing the share of labor, and ultimately, is there a solution to a market minus the consuming power of labor?
Thanks, Sudipto. Can I ask people, there are lots of questions, so can I ask people, please keep it short? Srijit. Okay, and then...
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. I have three queries, comments. One is when you said that, Professor Badhan, about the cultural demise of the cultural motives of the labor, but at the same time, the capital or the right is actually using cultural motifs, icons of the labor to bring them to their fold. The second thing, it is a point that labor, if they are involved in capital, then innovations can be labor absorbing. But actually what we see both in recent times during COVID and subsequently also, both left and so-called left-leaning as well as right-leaning institutions or state, as you have pointed out, state, have actually silencing alternative views and concern. And the third thing, when you refer to Solo's point, how would you link Gandhi's trusteeship on that? Gandhiji's trusteeship. Thank you.
Okay. Pranata, do you want to give a few
Yeah, I think there's
responses?
already too many questions to handle.
Let's
How much
take a few
time
here.
we have? 5 minutes. So these big questions, I don't think I have the time to answer any of them, nor do I always have the answers. So let me make just, am I audible? Mentioned a few rambling thoughts. One is on the issue of globalization. I find on globalization, people both on the right as well as the left take quite often an extreme negative position. Globalization is bad. This position is taken by the left in most countries. This position is also taken by Trump and Trump-like politicians in most countries. So I want to point out that there are some, I can understand the negative effects of globalization. You don't have to point out. I've already mentioned globalization as one of the problems labor has, and I gave some reasoning. But we should not also lose sight of the point that globalization has also helped many, in spite of all our critique of neoliberalism, has also helped many poor people, many poor women. The women of Bangladesh garment industry, or women in Vietnam, not just garment but many other electronic and manufacturing industries, they are in favor of globalization. In fact, ironically, there are now quite a few surveys of attitude to globalization taken in many countries. Strangely, in the rich countries, people are against globalization. The strongest anti-global is France. And the strongest pro-global are Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, and relatively poor countries, and quite often helping women work. Now, I'm not saying this is all globalization does. Globalization does lot of harmful things, but one should not completely ignore the aspect of positive effects of globalization. And it's the rich countries which are now turning against globalization because they can no longer dominate international trade as they used to for centuries. The other point that I want to make about point that Gita mentioned about the state, and I think I largely agree with the points that you made. Let me just, again, I want to spend time on points where I agree. So let me bring out where I slightly disagree. The state sector also, the effect of it depends on who captures the state. In many countries, the state is captured by capital, and therefore, it's the state also is anti-labor. But also, I would say here, trade unions also have a role. And let me go back many decades back to my experience in Kerala. I talk about it in my memoir, which I'll discuss this evening. So, for the first and last time in my life, I advised a government, was the Kerala government, under pressure of my friend K.N. Raj, which was Achyut Menon's government at that time. So he made me the chairman of a plantation inquiry commission, and I moved all around Kerala at that time. So as part of my job, I interviewed large number of trade union leaders, and in fact, I organized a gathering of trade union leaders. And since I was looking at the plantations, at that time, they were all foreign-owned. Most of them were foreign-owned. They, whether it's a left trade union, whichever left party, or even Congress left trade union, they all want nationalization. They asked me to recommend nationalization of plantation. I said, okay, I understand the arguments of takeover. But how do you react to me saying that nationalization means taken over by IAS officers and other bureaucrats run those plantations? Do we really want that? If instead I suggest to Achyut Menon that the plantation should be taken over from these foreign owners and given it to workers, you, the trade union people, should take responsibility of running them. And I said there are two major problems of workers running these plantations. One is credit. How do you organize credit that you need for any business? And the other is risk capital, because running any business requires taking risks. Suppose, along with nationalization, I suggest that you trade unions take the responsibility. Essentially, I was thinking of workers' cooperative, trade unions take the responsibility of running this organization, and I will make specific recommendation of helping with credit and mobilizing of risk capital. I was surprised. All the trade unions almost immediately said, no, we don't want workers. They want the bureaucrats take over, and so they can agitate for wage increase. So trade unions' role in reorganization in a positive direction has also not been very positive in this country. There are some, I could give you examples from social democratic countries where trade unions have played a more positive role. A third thing that I wanted to mention is, I think, the last thing that you mentioned about caste and class. And there I have seriously thought, in fact, there a big difference between left in West Bengal, where I am from, and left in Kerala, has always struck me. In Kerala, the class-caste issue has been handled somewhat more subtly than in West Bengal. In West Bengal, not just other parties, even the Communist Party is predominantly upper caste. And quite often, wittingly or unwittingly, they ignore the interests of the lower castes. This is very much so in West Bengal. And one of the reasons of the decline of the left, there are 20 reasons I have written on this. One of the reasons is that caste mobilization is something that West Bengal leftists have generally ignored. On Sudipta's issues of the migration, I very much agree. The existing household surveys, the sampling design is not very well oriented to that. And that is something I think there are methods of handling it, but those are not used. In Europe, I've seen some ways of capturing, but not in India. And my last comment would be on this cultural issue of Gandhism, trusteeship. Frankly, I do not believe in trusteeship. Gandhiji has a kind of romantic faith that Birlas and Tatas will be trustees of human welfare. So far, in all these decades, we don't see the capitalists really becoming trustees. Quite often, labor will be helped not by capital giving you generosities from above. Labor has to demand. And that's why empowering labor, to me, is more important than just depending on the trust. There are some good capitalists. If you read the obituaries of Ratan Tata, people thought that he had been much more of a beneficiary capitalist, more humane capital than others. But there are differences of opinion on that too. But in general, it's the labor demand that's, to me, much more important than leaving things to capitalists to improve. Capitalists in general, all over the world, do things for labor only when they are compelled to. Thank you.
I'm sorry, friends, we're out of time. As I said, today is a very long day. So let's please join me in thanking Professor Bardhan for a really provocative and interesting keynote address. Thank you, and I think we're moving to the next session.
Hello.
otherwise the time should not be wasted for that. Just to make sure that who are the people. So this one is Ram Singh and Sundari Ravindran. So Sundari Ravindran's slides she sent. Both the slides are available.
Good morning, everyone. So please settle down. We will start our session on poverty, inequality, and welfare. So for the first session, we have our chair, Professor Amit Shovan Ray, who was the former director here at CDS from 2013 to 2016, and now is the professor at School of International Studies at JNU. The first presentation in this session is on the topic Health Inequalities in India and their Structural Drivers, an overview of recent evidence by Professor Sundari Ravindran, who is a professor at Achyuta Menon Center for Health Science Studies at the Sri Chitra Tirunel Institute of Medical Science and Technology. For this paper, the discussant is Dr. Shubhrata Mukherjee, who is the Associate Professor of Economics at Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. The second paper is on the topic, Do Wealthy Underreport Their Income? By Professor Ram Singh, who is a director at DSC and also now the member of MPC. The discussant for this paper would be Professor Suraj Jacob, who is here professor at CDS. So the session will be for around 40-45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. Welcome you all, sir. The stage is yours. And one small announcement, the tea will be served at 11:30. Yeah, thank you. The stage is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. It feels great to be back to CDS. I begin with paying my sincere respect and devoted reverence for Professor Ken Raj, a distinguished development economist and the founding father of CDS. Although I have never had the opportunity to interact with Professor Raj personally, I considered it to be a great honor and privilege for me to be given the opportunity to serve an academic institution that was so close to his heart. I tried to follow and reinculcate his principles of academic rigor and excellence, combined with his passion for pursuing economics that helps the poor and paves the way for inclusive development. The research work that he and his team at CDS did for the UN in the 1970s had far-reaching consequences for development economics and policy. It changed the way development economists and policymakers used to look at the process of development. From their primary and often exclusive focus on macroeconomic aggregates such as GDP and its growth rates, inflation, etc., there was a perceptible shift where societal well-being and human development were brought into the center stage of development economics. Usually, fundamental theories in economics, including economics of development, invariably originated out of research carried out in the West by Western scholars. By Western scholars, I also include Professor Bardhan. But Ken Raj's path-breaking research at CDS on the Kerala model of development was an exception. It not only informed development theory, but also shaped the future trajectory of development policy that started placing greater emphasis on issues of poverty, inequality, education, health, and welfare as the primary goals of development. The multidimensionality of development as a concept started gaining momentum right after Professor Raj's pioneering research, and of course, ultimately culminating in the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitosi Commission report in 2007 on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, providing clear guidelines on the multidimensional parameters to measure development. During my tenure as director CDS, I was fortunate enough to generate some research funds to come up with a comprehensive multidimensional index of development following the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitosi guidelines for a comparative assessment of the Indian states, which was subsequently published by Routledge for the Global Edition and Orient Black Swan and Social Science Press for the South Asia edition. As director CDS, this was my personal tribute to Professor Raj. And I'm deeply honored to be asked to chair this very important session on poverty, inequality, and welfare. I must thank Director Viramani for this very kind invitation. Thank you. We have two very distinguished speakers at this session, and without further delay, I invite our first speaker, Professor Sundari Ravindran, to present her work. She just corrected the introducer, saying that she is no longer a professor, but she is retired professor. So I take responsibility for this inadvertent error by the introducer. Ma'am.
This one, is it? Yeah. Respected chairperson and my dear friends, I think I am vertically challenged. You may not even see my face if I go behind here. So anyway, on behalf of my co-authors, Sapna Mishra and Sarita Vishwan, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to present before you the overview of recent evidence on health inequities in India. Before I start with the actual presentation, I would like to share an anecdote which I remember from my time here as a student. When in class one day, I think it was a student presentation, and one of my classmates had asked in the presence of Professor Raj whether a problem was worth studying. And I remember him saying, "Is it a real life problem?" then it is. I think this statement has remained with me and probably given me the courage to meander across disciplinary boundaries in search of answers for real life problems. So with that, let me proceed. This presentation is about health inequities in India, and I will go through the definitions, the conceptual framework that guides my thinking, and go through the context and give you recent evidence. And what do I mean by the recent evidence? I had been part of a team which produced a synthesis of evidence on health inequities in India from up to 2015, and this was published by Springer in 2018. And I have updated that from 2016 to 24 based on published material in English, and also my colleagues, co-authors, have analyzed the NFHS 5 raw data to look at some of the trends. And if you ask why inequality, I have there, and I won't go into it because it is, health inequity is probably one of the worst, most pernicious kind of inequity. So to the definition, health inequities are avoidable and unfair differences in health status or in the distribution of health resources between different population groups arising from the unequal social conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. This is an updated WHO definition from an earlier one. And what guides my understanding of how health inequities come about, there are many frameworks, but something that I have found to be most pragmatic is a framework by Deirdrickson et al. That was produced almost 25 years ago, which identifies 4 pathways to health inequities, and because of that, they also identify 4 policy windows or policy options through which health inequities can be addressed. The first reason or pathway to health inequity is social stratification, which locates each of us in social position by caste, class, gender, and other axes of privilege or underprivilege. Now, this social position puts you in a situation of differential exposure to health risks because of your living conditions, your working conditions, your access to food, and all that. And also intergenerationally and through your childhood exposures creates differential vulnerabilities. So because of both of which, you have a differential occurrence of diseases and injuries. And there is a role for the way the health system acts to either accentuate or ameliorate or make up for these through social protection schemes and so on. So you are led to differential consequences as a result of that injury or illness. And very elegantly then, they suggest 4 policy entry points. First, upstream, attack social stratification. Second, do something about the differential exposure by improving on living conditions, working conditions, and other hazards and environmental factors. Decrease vulnerability by interventions at vulnerable life course points, and introduce suitable health system conditions that will make up for differential social consequences of ill health, which, if left unattended, could contribute to further social stratification. So just very briefly that. And I'll go through quickly the context of economic, social, and gender inequalities in India. I'll just rush through this because you, I think, are already familiar. Everybody here is familiar with the increasing, widening income and wealth inequalities. These are figures from Bharti, Piketty et al. Recent. But the more important, I find, not usually noticed and only studied by a few, is that there are persisting inequalities by SC/ST status. And this is inequalities in wealth. That is from the Bharti Piketty calculation. There is also multidimensional poverty has a stepwise decrease as you go from scheduled tribe to other castes. And while we cannot deny that there is a convergence on some indicators like primary education and so on, in terms of, caste, the disadvantaged caste, these are coming closer together. This is not happening at the top end of education and wage earning categories. And the NFHS 5, which we tabulated, shows there is a very stepwise association between living conditions and caste status. Now, gender-based inequalities, stark gender gaps, low participation in the workforce, low wages, social norms and cultural norms that continue to prefer sons and discriminate against daughters, and the presence of intimate partner violence. But something very interesting that I found by stratifying the data on disadvantages that women face by caste, we find that some disadvantages are higher among non-SC/ST women, like not having money that they can spend, not being able to go outside their village alone, and cannot refuse sex within marriage. This intersectional lens, which makes you see the nuances that all castes are not equally privileged across all genders. Now, health inequities in India, what do we know? This is a bit dense because about 53 publications summarized along with some data. And this presentation is supported by a set of annexure tables that were shared. So basically, socioeconomic gradient is there with worse outcomes for lower socioeconomic position, nothing new there. But it is across various health indicators. But when you come to non-communicable diseases, you have the reverse gradient with those in higher socioeconomic position having a higher incidence and prevalence, multimorbidity, and also risk factors for non-communicable diseases. What do I mean by socioeconomic position here? All this information looks at socioeconomic position across two indicators. One is education or mother's education in the case of children's health status, and the other is wealth index as calculated by the LASI, that is the Longitudinal Aging Survey of India, and also the National Family Health Survey, which is based on assets owned by the household and stratified into wealth indices. Now, although you have the well-off more at risk and more prevalent, more in terms of NCDs, the awareness, the initiation of treatment, and control of those diseases again follows the predictable socioeconomic gradient of being very low among the poorer and high among the better off. Now, there is also health inequities by caste and ethnicity, where SC and ST groups fare worse than other caste groups for most, except there is one exception that I found. And it's either the ST or the SC, not both, and therefore a warning to those who combine ST and SC into one category. So you have various indicators where the scheduled tribe do very badly and the scheduled caste in some others, except in terms of anemia in women of reproductive age. Nobody has asked what is the pathway and has not really explored except for two studies here. One which looked into inequalities in under 5 stunting, and they say there are 2 pathways to this. One that is intergenerational, coming from disadvantages at birth, and the other at disadvantages from 0 to 5. But the very interesting, this is a study by Kofi et al., 38 in my reference list. It says that unlike studies on racial inequalities, this particular study, it's not a large-scale study. Scheduled caste children who grew up in scheduled caste hamlets rather than in mixed neighborhoods were much better off in terms of advantage for height than those who grew up in mixed neighborhoods where discrimination was experienced. And they show that the pathway was a feeling of being discriminated, and no further explanation is given. And I think this is a fascinating area to probe further into. What are the actual biological pathways that this could translate into an advantage? Then there are sex differences and gender-based health inequities. Now, although there are biological inequities, you find child mortality is higher among females in India. Very, very few countries in the world have a higher child mortality. This is 1 to 4 years. And there is no significant sex difference in nutritional status. Women have lower prevalence of hypertension and diabetes mellitus, but higher proportion of women, so they have some advantages. Male prevalence of various communicable diseases is higher. Injuries are also higher among. But there were some studies that looked at could this be because of gender? And one very interesting study that I'll mention and I'll move on is that there was a study that compared girls with their twin brothers in a subsample of NFHS. And they found that girls had 27% higher postneonatal under 5 mortality as compared to their male twin brothers, and they conclude that this cannot be anything but gender discrimination. And there are other gender-based barriers to healthcare access. I've purposely taken here the most privileged women. So among rich women, the highest wealth quintile, money, not wanting to go alone, not allowed to go alone to the health center, and worries because there is no female provider. So among rich, non-SC/ST, and women who have completed high school, there is still a major barrier to accessing healthcare. Very few studies look beyond individual categories of caste only or class only or gender. But those who have taken, and we have also done some analysis of the women of reproductive age by wealth and caste. It's already done, 15 minutes over? 2 minutes, okay. So there are intersectional inequities, and one has to highlight that it is very important to go beyond just looking at single categories. Geeta Sen here and her colleagues were among the first to look at intersectional inequalities from a quantitative perspective. And since then, only 4 or 5 studies have come. Now, I also want to make the point that the health system can contribute to reducing health inequities by ensuring universal health care and minimizing out-of-pocket expenditure, but unfortunately, this has not been in its role. So I want to conclude with 2 slides which say that the research on health inequities in India, unfortunately, does not provide us with the evidence we need to address these inequities, because it does not address the why questions. It repeatedly addresses the what and how much question. And it also then because it relies on national surveys, large-scale data, doesn't show you the pathways, and sometimes it can result in victim blaming. These groups never improve, you know, kind of things. There are major research gaps for many, many groups. And the way forward, and this is based on many other studies that I have done, one is the need to get away from merely focusing on health inequities as gaps, you know, gaps in the distribution of resources. Because it is not just those gaps. There are many unmeasurables. There are many non-material, you know, vulnerabilities, aspects such as recognition, dignity, participation, which ranks very high among the experiences of women, especially from the deprived communities. And then we need to evolve nuanced indicators that capture the assault on well-being of everyday violence as the pathway. Not just education, employment, and so on, you know. Poverty, hunger, insecurity, displacement, conflict. And I would say most of the research, even 5 years update, is not theory-driven. There is a lot of ad hoc post-facto theorizing based on regression analysis. Then asking the right questions, focusing on the whys and what can be done, and methodological innovations, and I think CDS is the right place to talk about this, to have the courage and the boldness to step into many disciplines that will give you the tool to answer these questions, and also fundamental changes in research funding and governance, which at the moment gives very, very little funding for study of these issues. Thank you. I hope I kept the time.
Thank you very much, and for a wonderful presentation, which kind of, you know, sort of raises questions and throws up a lot of challenge to youngsters sitting here in CDS for future research, because you've rightly pointed out the why is the most important question in this regard, rather than what has happened and how it has happened, you know. So, but thank you very much, Professor Ravindran. I request Dr. Mukherjee to please come and discuss the paper. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very interesting paper for those of us who have been working on issues related to health inequality. And it all goes back to our initial readings of Michael Marmot's, the initial work on the social determinants of health of the British, you know, the civil servants. That, and then it was later extended by, given an economic perspective, when Deaton in 2005 worked on the connection between the income inequality and health inequality. And surprisingly, he did not find any direct link. Only the link which was empirically evident was the relation between health and income, the gradient dependent on the between group and within group inequality. Now, though there was no empirical link found connecting the income inequality and health inequality, actually he suggested that it probably works due to the nonlinear effect of income effect, relative deprivation, public goods provision, nutritional traps, and the credit restriction. Now, this is very important because as we go back to Arrow's 1963 paper, on the first paper on health economics, he says that healthcare is just one of the determinants of health status, and there are a lot of other factors beyond the purview of the health sector which actually probably contributes to the health status. So when we look at the different indicators and you know, empirically measure inequality, there is a need for looking at the institutions, because a large part of health status and health status related inequality, the source is actually outside the health sector. So this is point number one. From the very beginning, somehow, because of it's appropriate to measure, the health inequality is measured as a group inequality, not like the way we measure the wealth and income. Now, one limitations of measuring health inequality at the group level is that you tend to ignore the intra-group inequality. And we have done work in Kerala context in Wayanad, where we found even within the scheduled tribe community, there's a huge intra-group inequality across different subgroups of the scheduled tribe. This is one aspect. And finally, my point would be to one aspect I would like to focus. That's the growing emergence of the chronic disease. So, chronic disease is something which the access to the chronic healthcare is something which is not studied enough. The burden of chronic disease is increasing, and we have very little work on the actually studying the access, inequality in access that different groups of people they experience in terms of accessing the chronic healthcare, because from the very beginning, the structuring of our health system, the public health system is focused towards the reproductive child healthcare, and those healthcare which are mostly in the domain of the primary and largely the secondary healthcare. So not much about the tertiary healthcare which are included. And yes, these are some of the points that I wanted to make here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukherjee. I think we should open it up for discussion after the session, because depending on the time that we have. So now I request Professor Ram Singh, Director of Delhi School of Economics, and well, he was a former colleague at JNU, so pleasure to welcome you to deliver your speech. 15 minutes, please, Ram.
15 minutes. Yeah. That's generous. Thank you, Professor Ray. When I asked him first, how much time will you give me? He said 10 minutes. So, but I said schedule says 15 minutes. So he had settled for 15 minutes time. Thank you so much. So, very good morning again. I am going to address the question listed here, do the wealthy underreport their income? In the process of presenting to you findings of this paper, I will be able to address some of the issues raised by Professor Pranav Bardhan this morning. And my broad point would be that that we need to do more research to understand the state of various kinds of inequalities in India, the point that Professor Ravindran made a few minutes ago. So that remains true of income inequalities and other forms of inequalities as well. Even though the focus of my paper is to examine income reporting behavior of different wealth groups. The focus is on checking empirical relationship, the wealth, your wealth and income you report to income tax authorities. I will focus on mid and upper wealth levels, and in the process my empirical findings will give a fairly persuasive proof evidence of tax evasion and also tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is legal. Tax evasion is something when we commit tax evasion that we are committing illegality, but tax avoidance is reducing your tax liability within the letter of the law, tax law. So, but the question I want to start with basic question, what do we know about income reporting behavior of wealth groups? So, surprisingly, we know very little. We have seen some media leaks. like say leaks by ProPublica that got hold of IRS files. So these were leaks. These were not official documents available in public domain. But these leaks suggest that, that wealthies, even in developed countries, pay very little by way of income tax. That, in other words, means that they report very little by way of their income. Something similar is true in case of India. So these photos, these pictures here, I have picked them from newspapers, and I take that most of you recognize these faces. These faces are celebrities, cricketers, Hollywood, Bollywood stars. And all of them are well-off people. They are also among the highest income taxpayers in India. But I want you, if I were to ask you a question, are they wealthiest of Indians? Answer is no. So these people are really well-off. They report, they are among the top income taxpayers and therefore top income reporters in India, but they are not wealthiest of Indians. That point should be clear. But again, this evidence comes from media reports. These are not empirical findings based on publicly available data. And this context makes a case for empirically examining relationship between income and wealth. We already know a lot about income and wealth, but at national level. So Piketty and his lab, they have systematically documented the relationship between national wealth and national income, group level wealth and group level incomes. There's very little these studies have produced at micro level relationship between unit level, individual level wealth and income reported, family level wealth and income reported by the families. The reason is, and this is true not only for India, but across the world, except the reason is that we do not have unit level data. We have not had unit level data on income and wealth simultaneously. So thanks to Election Commission of India, something unique has happened in our country, guided by very different consideration. Election Commission of India has produced a massive, very useful data source. And this data source comes in the form of election filings, affidavits, sworn affidavits we file when we contest election for parliament, for state assemblies, and now in some states even for panchayats. So these are remarkable source, a very rich source of information. That's what I use. So, and I supplement this data extracted from sworn affidavits by election contestant. I supplement this data with the data published by Central Board of Direct Taxation, Forbes list, and company accounts to compute various kinds of capital income. So together, putting these data sets together, I am able to complete the wealth spectrum, not by way of studying the distribution, but by way of coverage. And so given the, and this data, the results I present to you, they pertain to 2 years, 2 general election for Lok Sabha years 2014 and 2019. So these documents give extensive information about assets you hold, market value of assets, every single form of assets, every single form of capital and wealth you own. They also require contestants to report income, not your not your whole income, but the income you reported to income tax department. So that information is also there in these affidavits. So it turns out that, so the data as a whole, it's fairly representative, it's pan-Indian data, it thanks to reservations, it represents most social groups in India, and together it gives more than 15,000 observations. It turns out that out of 15,000 observations, about 50% do not report income. And my sense is that they do not report income in these affidavits because they have not filed income tax returns because their income falls below the taxable threshold. So let me skip these details. The results are based on data whose density plots you can see here. So the log normal densities are fairly normal, and therefore I'm going to be using, for this region and several others, I'm going to be using log specifications in my empirical results. So the data as such, it passes what I will call smell test, in the sense that it shows concentration of income and wealth at the top, as was pointed out by Professor Bardhan this morning. And also the asset portfolio, the portfolio allocations of equity versus real estate versus fixed deposits versus durable assets. Those patterns also seem to be in sync with what we know from other sources for India and also internationally. Now, now the paper has a theoretical framework. I'm not going to present it, but I just want to say something about theoretical prediction coming from the paper. Before you read these propositions, these claims, I want you to keep in mind that Indian income tax law requires you to report all your labor income, wages, honoraria, and so on, and also your direct capital income. Your capital income can be divided in two parts, what I call direct income. For example, if you have invested in real estate, in mutual funds or stock market, and also fixed accounts. All these forms of investment can lead to capital appreciation. That is not required to be reported. What is required to be reported to tax authorities is the direct income from these assets. Interest you earn on fixed deposits, rental income you earn if you have a real estate investment, and dividend income you get from mutual funds or stock market investments. So the direct income is required to be reported, direct capital income and labor income. Only these incomes are required to be reported to tax authorities. Now, if we keep this in mind, I present a theoretical framework that shows that capital, the total income, labor plus direct capital income as a ratio of wealth, it is going to be decreasing as wealth increases. In this backdrop, let me show you the plots. These plots, as I stated, the prediction is that income divided by wealth is going to be decreasing in wealth. In other words, wealthier a household is, smaller will be, lower will be its income relative to its wealth. So this may seem a little unsettling, but it has theoretical and empirical foundations, not only in this paper, but in other contexts also. I have studied two types of income. One is the taxable income we report as a taxable. These are the plots vis-a-vis taxable income. But I also have computed, estimated tax-exempt income. For example, agricultural income is tax-exempt. There were times when our dividend income up to 10 lakhs, annual of dividend income up to 10 lakh was also tax-exempt. I have computed all the forms of exempt capital income and supplemented that, and these are the plots. Again, income as a ratio of wealth is decreasing in wealth. So wealthier individuals report relatively less income, lower income relative to their wealth. And these are the range plots of the estimates that I have gone for. Now, let me spend 1 or 2 minutes on empirical results. So as I have stated, as you have seen in these plots, income-wealth ratio, Piketty focuses on wealth-income ratio, my focus is on income-wealth ratio for different regions. And I also want to take 10 seconds out of this presentation that, you know, this work has been, I have put in more than 3 years to put all this data and this analysis together. And in the first draft was very unwieldy. It had upward of 80 pages. And I approached Professor K.L. Krishna with the first draft, which was not reader-friendly at all. But he is always very kind. He went through the entire draft. The draft circulated for this conference has I think, less than 50 pages. It's at 40 plus pages. You can see the kind of adjustments that have gone. So Professor Krishna's intellectual inputs have played important role in shaping my thinking for this exercise. Taking you back to the analysis, the negative relationship between income-wealth ratio and wealth, it is very robust. It comes out, for 1% increase in wealth, you may see a decrease of more than half a percentage point of reported income-wealth ratio. And also something, if you look at coefficient science and coefficient of agriculture income, I have in this specification, I control for host of portfolio effects and also individual characteristics. Vis-a-vis portfolio effects, I find negative sign of higher the share of agriculture income in your portfolio, lower is the income you report ceteris paribus. We know that agriculture income agriculture is misused for evading tax. Similar seems to be the case vis-a-vis commercial properties. Something that might interest you is that the sign of vote share. Sign of vote share, it captures votes received by a candidate. It is positively related. It shows that serious candidates who are seriously in the reckoning, political reckoning, they show higher income. That's because, and this is noteworthy, that their filings are out there in public domain. Anybody, their opponents, media, and researchers can scrutinize, whereas your and mine tax filings are private information. So there's greater sunlight falling on serious political candidates, and that seems to play out in the form of their reporting behavior. Now, I want to go to national income accounts. The reason is that I showed you downward slope of income-wealth ratio. By that in itself, 2 minutes. 1 minute. So that in itself does not tell us much about whether there is a tax avoidance happening or not, because the ratio is predicted to be decreasing. The point is that how do we know that there's a tax avoidance happening? To compute a reference point, I use national income accounts. To compute rate of return on capital in India. That exercise gives me that average rate of return in capital in India turns, for the period covered in this study, it turns out to be more than 7%. In this exercise, I find that the share of wages is more than 40%, is actually less than 40%. That means that share of capital sorry, I got the other way around. The share of wages is falling consistently below 60%, and share of capital in this period also has been increasing. So using share of capital in national income, I compute rate of returns, and its average rate is 7.2%. It means that if I look at only your capital income, on average, it should be 7.2% equivalent of your wealth. Whereas what I find that the total income, labor plus all forms of capital income reported by wealthiest 1% is less than 2% equivalent of their wealth. If I look at 0.1%, remember this data also covers Forbes listed families and individuals. If I focus on them, then the income reported, total income reported by them turns out to be less than about half a percentage point of their wealth. This, and this plot, basically import of this plot is to show that top wealthiest 15% Indians have income, capital income, that is greater than, that is expected to be greater than total income they report. And the wedge between what is your expected reported income and actual reported income, that increases as wealth levels go up. Now, half a minute, just half a minute. To give you a sense of what's going on, the dynamics of this is that my sense is that at the top wealth level, there is very little illegality happening. But there's scope for legally splitting your capital income. One leading form of splitting your capital income, your profit income, would be to choose how much profit you pay out as dividend and how much you retain in your company accounts. To reduce your tax liability, it is incentive compatible for corporations to pay as little as possible by way of dividend. Dividend yield ratio in India and US are among lowest in the world. And that means that very little gets paid out by way of dividend income and also labor income. The problem in 2008-9, we blamed bankers that bankers paid themselves too much. Problem with Indian wealthy is that they pay themselves very little. If they paid themselves more, it will show up in income tax accounts. We will have more of tax revenue and therefore more funds for funding public goods. Last 5 seconds is that this plot also shows the wedge between the expected income of wealthy groups versus income that gets reported in income tax data. But income inequality estimates are based on income tax data. Point of this paper is to show that income tax data does not capture all the income at the top, and to that extent, it does not capture inequalities, especially at the top. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ram, for a fascinating paper and presentation, and a very unique use of elections data to look at inequality and income tax payment at the top level. Thank you. I request Professor Suraj Jacob, please discuss that.
As the chair said, and I think as the presenter, as Ram Singh mentioned, it took you 3 years and more. I think this is a very elaborate, very conscientious effort at gathering lots of different data sets to make a very basic point. So I hope you all kind of appreciate the basic question that he's trying to address. I don't have much time, but the conventional expectation is that those with more wealth have more risk-taking ability. Therefore, you would expect disproportionately greater share of income in their wealth. So you would actually expect the income-wealth ratio to increase with wealth, right? This is because of the risk-reward trade-off. But what we are finding, fundamentally, the graph on the left, I recreated it from the data provided in the paper. The graph on the left clearly shows, so each of the bars on the left is 5%, right? So that 20 bars across his data set, you can clearly see that as wealth increases, people are putting greater share of their wealth in risky assets, as you would expect. And yet the graph on the right shows that the income wealth ratio falls with wealth, right? So this goes against the conventional expectation. In fact, for the very first decile, income is more than wealth, but it goes progressively lower, as he was saying, to the top 5%, 1%, it's extremely small, right? And for the very wealthy groups, the reported income wealth ratio is far lower than expected rate of return on assets, right? So there are clear implications for what we mean by progressivity of taxation. The last point that he made in the presentation, that reported income is not a good indicator. We've known this, of course, for the rural sector, right? Land versus income and so on, but I think this is a very conscientious, careful, elaborate effort to to show this fundamental point. This raises now the question, what explains the belied expectation, right? We would have expected income wealth ratio to rise. All this enormous exercise, very much worth it, shows that it fell. It falls across income quintiles, deciles, percentiles. So what explains it? And the broad answer is underreporting, tax evasion, avoidance, as he gave the example of farmland, other commercial properties, other forms of evasion and avoidance. And he uses very useful, interesting ways of trying to estimate how it would have been, because the election data actually gives all the assets, if not all the reported income. So he goes around actually calculating how much they ought to have earned, right? So there's a way to actually calculate the missing income. So just kudos to do all that.
And so now I want to raise some questions raised by this paper in the spirit of Raj and the kinds of things we were discussing, right? So fundamentally the point is, as wealth increases, there is a redistribution in the asset structure such that reported income is much lower than expected, right? So this takes us directly to important political economy questions. So these are not questions that the paper covers because I think all the effort was, but I think what's good about this paper is we can really ask interesting questions about political economy because of the empirics. So first question, what I've put here on the left, why is it harder to measure income and assets of the very rich than the poor? Second question, what does this tell us about quote unquote informality which is attributed to the poor alone? We know, for example, by the work of Ananya Roy and many others, especially for urban land, that there is so much hera-fairy, informality at the top of the wealth distribution. And yet the language of informality, right, and these kinds of fluidities is always attributed to the lower end of the spectrum. So I think there are some fundamental questions this raises as to how we view distributions. And so the stuff I've put on the right, what does this tell us about the nature of the state and the role of big business? Something that we had started discussing in the later sessions yesterday, something which was brought up by Professor Bardhan. In fact, could we even speculate that underreporting and avoidance evasion is allowed by design? Right? Why is it that it's the Tendulkars and the Amitabh Bachchans, right, who pay the highest income taxes, right? The reason I'm raising this question is because while we must have narrow policy technical fixes, I don't think that's going to fix anything much because there is probably something larger about the system which allows this. The very language we use about informality suggests this. So can I take a minute more or probably not? We'll skip, yeah. I think there's some technical stuff you can do. I think you can use RDD to look at election results. You can use PSM and so on. But fundamentally, I think this raises the political economy question of, is this not by design? By design, I mean not formally, but is there not something about who governs the state, who constitutes the state, which actually allows this kind of fluidity? Even though in policy discourse, we always attribute fluidity to the lower end. It's the poor who have informality. But especially the work of Ananya Roy, which is now a bit dated, 15 years back, and many others have shown that this is also a myth. But it's a convenient myth, and I think your work shows that. So I think it's very, we can build much on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jacob, for a very interesting discussion. Let me seek the permission of the chairman and the director. May I have 5 more minutes or maybe 2 minutes to at least seek some questions from the students, May I first invite students, because I mean, of course, the last issue that was raised, the fluidity of the system, whether it's by design, I think Professor Mandal would be the most eminent person to be addressing that concern. But I don't want to put you in a spot. So, with your expertise and your stature in public finance, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, but students, if you don't have, then I have questions from. Yes, Aishwarya, right?
Yes.
Yes, we met yesterday, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask my question to Sundari ma'am. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing such an important topic to our notice and for taking the intersectional approach for looking at health inequality. I just have one clarificatory question. That do intergroup differences between caste groups persist over income quintiles? And if they do, then what do you think could be the reasons? And also you also mentioned that very easily we could fall into the trap of looking like we are saying that these groups will never improve. that if the, even after income, reaching the higher income quintiles, the differences persist. It could very easily, if we write about this, it could easily be, taken into another context altogether. So how does one refrain from getting into that trap? How do we write it if we do not intend to do that?
Right, thank you. Maybe we can take one more question, maybe addressed to Professor Ram Singh. Because we have so little time.
I had just two quick questions. The first one is, it's more like I'm just thinking loud. What does it have, what do you have to say about the marginal utility of wealth? When we typically plot, think about the risk-averse individual, we say that, the marginal utility of wealth diminishes at higher levels. So, so what theoretical implications do we have here? Is it really to higher levels of income? Are you really seeing that pattern here, or is it going contrary to our theory? That's one. And second is, what do you think about post-COVID? Do you think that this trend would have strengthened this because there's a higher level of financial activity, more people investing in the mutual funds market? So that's the second question.
Thank you. Maybe we can take one more. Yes.
I have two questions related to the data only. The first one is about your computation of income itself. Now, if you are taking what is the declared income, then if the capital stock acquisition is through debt financing, then to what extent have you adjusted for the interest expense? I am asking this question because if you look at AID's report, as you actually move up from lower decile to the higher decile, debt to asset ratio is very high. So that means large portion of the asset is getting financed by debt. And similarly, when we look at the access to formal finance, you'll find that households belonging to the top decile has far more better access. So this adjustment, I don't know whether you have done it or not. Even in income tax declaration, I'll give you one example.
Please leave it to the questions only, no observations, because we are running out of time.
That's one. Second one is, how did you compute capital gain? Because it has got numerator, denominator. Numerator, I believe you are taken from NAS. But denominator, if you are, I'm sure there's a lot of market valuation of the wealth is involved. So is there anything that you would like to comment? Because both the questions, if taken care of, it can alter the direction in which, at least it can reduce the magnitude of the fall in the ratio.
Thank you. Yes, please. That's the last question.
Thank you. Thank you. And just a question for Sundari as well. Adding to the questions earlier, do you see any, first of all, thank you for a very clear and comprehensive presentation. Did you see any regional insights? Did you have regional insights into the gender inequality with the data that you saw?
Thank you very much. The floor is yours. You may take a minute.
Yeah. Aishwarya and Rachel, both. This was a narrative synthesis of existing evidence. And it is not analysis of data that I have looked at, except that I did some very simple two-way analysis of women of reproductive age, NFHS 5 data by wealth quintiles and caste. Now there, and I had the time only to look at all India data. So there, yes, there is on many indicators a stepwise inequality, where among the, in each wealth category, you have scheduled tribes faring worse, then scheduled caste, and then non-SC/ST, if you take it like that. And it is only there are deviations from this for particular health indicators, for which I have no explanation unless we look more into it. And whether there are regional differences, that requires a lot of work, and I hope somebody takes it up. There are bound to be regional differences. And from older studies, yes, very beautiful stepwise, if you divide aspirational districts versus others, then such inequalities have been found. So we don't know what the situation is now. Thanks.
Thank you. Ram, maybe 1 minute to respond, I mean, if you choose to.
Both are very important, 1 minute, and if I choose to, I certainly choose to. I want to thank you for asking these very interesting questions. Dr. Jacob, I will come towards the end if there is a few seconds left. You know, about your point, the attitude towards risk as wealth grows. One manifestation of this would be that asset allocation will become riskier and riskier. If we assume that the risk aversion decreases with wealth, then portfolios become riskier with wealth. That's what I find in the data. So what I find in the data is consistent with the diminishing aversion towards risk and increasing appetite for risk. About your point about the after effects of COVID-20, you know, that's next. It's basically this paper lays down a research agenda, and I will be extending this the research to cover subsequent post-COVID years. But I will not be surprised if I find these effects more pronounced, for two reasons. That for the rate of return on capital seems to have increased post-COVID. And on that count, the divergence between reported and estimated income, if it goes up, I will not be surprised by the fact. As to the other question, you know, so what you have said, your conjecture is right, and it's very much in the data, that it's the wealthier who can leverage their assets to get debt. And we find that's what we see. So debt assets ratio is high at low wealth level and also at high wealth level. So about your point about capital gains, how do I account for capital gains? Answer is I do not. If I accounted for capital gains, then the point made by Dr. Jacob, we would expect increasing income wealth ratio to be increasing if I capture all sorts of gains from assets. Whereas I argued that income wealth ratio is decreasing in wealth. That's because I deliberately exclude capital gains. There are ways of quantifying capital gains, but then these the plots can be reversed. And then about the broader question, you know, so let me make just one point, and then it will be your call to stop me or let me continue. A point that is made by Dr. Jacob and this morning by Professor Burden, you know, on role of restricting flow of capital across national jurisdictions. The points made are that it can lead to financial instability. It also has implications for wages. It turns out that it has implications for direct tax regimes. The region that state, the government turns a blind eye towards, you know, the splitting, not reporting profit in the form of dividends and labor income is actually international dynamics. There's an apprehension that if you increase your corporate tax rates, if anything, we have been reducing it, that's international pressure. If we were to move in opposite direction, fear is that there'll be more capital flight. Now this fear may be perceived fear, but it also can be actual fear. The point is that it also, this paper also highlights one issue that is very challenging. You know, when we have capital account convertibility, it poses problems on this front also. Let me skip other important points, political economy points you have made, and I will be happy to discuss them over the tea. Yes.
Well, thank you. I think we had a fascinating session. We should give a big hand to the paper writers and the discussant.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, respected members, for the valuable time and presence. Now we all can break for tea. Tea is in Shamiana. We'll try to come back by 12:05. We're already running late by 20-25 minutes, and we have to do the next session also. So please try to come back by 12:05. Thank you. Hello, hello. Requesting everyone to please settle in. We'll start our next session now. Requesting everyone to please come in. We'll start our next session. I'll keep it out. Hello. Requesting everyone to please come in. We'll start our next session. Requesting everyone to please come in. We can start our next session. We can start. Okay. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Now we will be having a second session on poverty, inequality, and welfare. This session will be chaired by Professor Raman Mahadevan, who is an independent researcher and well-known economic historian. We will request you to take on the stage, sir. Professor Raman Mahadevan. The first paper of this session is on the topic Some Aspects of Trends in Inequality in India, which will be presented by Dr. J. Dennis Rajkumar, who is the director of EPWRF. Requesting you to take on stage, sir. The discussant of this paper would be Professor Krishna Kumar, who is an associate professor at Sri Venkateshwara College, New Delhi. The second paper is on the topic Multidimensional Index, a note by Professor Srijit Mishra, who is a professor at University of Hyderabad and was with IGIDF for 22 years. The discussant of this paper is Professor Uday Shankar Mishra, who is a professor at Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at IIPS, Mumbai. He was a former professor at CDS. Requesting Professor Raman Mahadevan to take over. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Since time is constrained, I do not wish to encroach on the time allotted to two very interesting presentation by two extremely outstanding scholars, Dr. Dennis Rajkumar and Professor Srijit Mishra. May I at the outset take the opportunity to thank Professor Veeramani and Professor Beena for having me over here on this very special occasion. Coming to CDS is almost a homecoming for me, having spent a good 13 years here between 1984 and 1996-97. I'm also deeply honored to be asked to chair this session on poverty, inequality, and welfarism. I cannot frankly claim to have any expertise in this fascinating area of inquiry. An outstanding and brilliant mind, Professor Raj, was among those rare economists who had a deep and abiding concern for the poor and marginalized, and following from it, a strong votary for inclusive growth. This is best reflected in most of his writings. I shall read out a small passage which captures forcefully this spirit. The problem is not one of merely rechanneling economic activity within the existing socio-economic framework, but the framework itself to be remolded, so as to enable it to accommodate progressively those fundamental urges which express themselves in the demand for right to work, the right to adequate income, the right to education, and to a measure of insurance against old age, sickness, and other disabilities. These are relevant today as they were when Raj wrote about this, and I think in the course of the last 2 days, it has been forcefully underlined by most of the presentation. With this, I will, since time is a constraint, I will ask Dennis to make his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Raman. It's nice to be back to the campus after a few decades. This paper we have titled as Some Aspects of Recent Trends in Economic Inequality in India. It's been co-authored by Vijay Bhaskar, who unfortunately could not attend the alumni meet as well as today's and tomorrow's sessions because of his urgent call that he had to attend from the ministry. In any case, I'm very happy that I had co-authored this paper with a friend of mine with whom I grew up on this campus. I'm also happy that this paper will be presented along with Srijit Mishra, who was also my classmate during my MPhil days. Coming to the topic, in fact, I must mention about why we embarked on this journey of examining inequality. That's because recently there is a growing concern about economic inequality with the work done by Bharati et al. Basically it is a group operating from London who are looking at rising inequality at the global level, and recently also they published a paper in EPW which generally talks about rising inequality. They go on to the extent of saying that when they map the inequality over the last few decades, they say that colonial Raj is being replaced by billion Raj. And you know the kind of backlash that kind of argument had. So there is also a growing consensus in economic literature which says that these Kuznets' typical U-shaped curve is no more valid. In the sense, what Kuznets did was, after he mapped the growth pattern and he looked at the distribution aspects of the income, then he said when an economy is on the takeoff stage with an accelerated growth, then there is a tendency for the inequality to rise. After a while, when the per capita income stabilizes, then there is a tendency for the inequality to drop. But none of the countries stands this test, and therefore this also has come to question. But more importantly, there are several papers which have, particularly Bharati and Co., which used income tax data, and they had shown that top 1 or 0.01% of the population has acquired more income related to the other segment of the population, etc. So we all know that there is an economic inequality in the society. But if you consider that as an economic structure, then particularly considering the nature of social structure in our country, then we pose one question, whether this economic structure is also getting influenced by the social structure. Basically, therefore, now posing this kind of question would mean what kind of data are we going to use? So that takes me to next point. What we have done is to show that in a different way. We are not actually following the typical method of top 1%, because it is very difficult to determine who constitutes this top 1%. So what we have done is, we have followed certain analytical classification of World Bank, though it is done for their own lending program, but still we thought we will extend to countries like India. And we have also looked at some of the former studies, which says that we are not very far from the way the World Bank has classified this. And we are actually superimposing the data from income tax returns. Then we are comparing this data with NAS, particularly the component of CES, that is compensation to employees, which reflects labor income. And having done so, we are trying to distribute how this compensation to employees is taking place across different income groups. Then to link it to social institutions, we are taking 3 major variables. As Kannan and Ravindran in their papers keep repeating that it is the labor market dynamics which feeds into the inequality process, we thought that we would actually look at labor market dynamics by looking at the income earned by different categories, social groups. Then what is the economic outcome? It should reflect on the asset holding as well as the consumption expenditure. Then we ask a question, what is the proportionate share of different social groups in the total assets as well as in total consumption? As we know that we are relying on the simple proportionate share approach, because the inequality is generally understood in, or the distribution of income is generally on the basis of proportionate share. So we are using the same route, and I'll just skip this slide. Yeah. This is the summary of our findings from the income tax returns. Now, why income tax returns? Because we know that income tax assessees are manifold, which includes individuals. If you look at an economic structure on the basis of institutional categories, then you have got households, you have got private corporate sector, and you have got government sector as well. Now, therefore, always distributing the GDP, right, we get into the problem of which sector do we have to distribute, right? And therefore, since we are talking about, not about corporates, not about government sector, we are actually talking about household sector, right? Now, within household sector, you have again another 3 subcategories. One is the typical salaried households. Another one is we talk about proprietary firms and or the self-employed, and the third one we call this private collectives. Here again, therefore, distributing the household sector's income itself is a problematic one, unless you have solid information on all the 3. Right. So what we have done is, we have looked at income tax data, and we thought that it is better we confine ourselves to only one segment of the household, which is individual, for which income tax data is available under various categories of income. So having said this, as you know, income tax return statistics is getting published by Central Board of Direct Taxes since 2011-12. Of course, they were published in the 50s also, but there was a lot of discontinuity in the publication. But now they are publishing it more in a systematic way, though we do not have much on the unit level data, but at least at the aggregate level, you have this set of information. And the types of income that is being declared by an individual, on the whole, you have gross total income, which directly goes into GDP. Then you have different sources of income, salary income, house property, whatever you see there. And then you have net income, which is there after adjusting for all tax exemptions. So since gross total income is directly it directly enters into GDP, we thought we will stick to gross total income. Now, to begin with, let me, if you see the second column, number of returns as percentage of the total population, you find that from the year 2011-12 to 2022-23, the percentage is on the rise. What does it mean? There are more tax returnees, right? There's no doubt about it. This is related to individual categories. And we have worked out the gross total income and its components as percentage of GDP. You see that as percentage of gross total income, the assessed income, right, has gone up from 14%. I'll just take 2 time points for comparison. But as you can see here, there is a steady trend. There is no fluctuations for you to observe. Therefore, in some of the slides, I would have taken only 2 time points for comparison. Now, what is very important is, although all components of the gross income of the individuals have gone up, if you see the rise in the salary income, it is much more, right? It has almost doubled. At the same time, if you see the rate of increase of business income, which is nothing but the income earned by self-employed category, and this self-employed category is also very important labor force insofar as our periodic labor force survey is concerned. That has also gone up. But at the same time, if you add the other components like house property income, which is nothing but rental income, then capital gains, both long-term and short-term, then you have other sources of income, which is nothing but dividend income, interest income, etc., etc. And if you sum up this house property income, capital gains, and other source of income, what we tend to conclude is they are nothing but a reflection of capital gains, or what we call it as property income, right? So, which means now we are having an opportunity by appropriately combining some source of income to relate to what is available in the national account statistics. Now, this is the overall trend. In this trend, as I said, the huge rise in the salary income is the major highlight. And if you sum up the capital gains, they have also gone up at a higher rate, and the rate at which business income has grown, it is actually slightly less. Now, the question is, since income tax statistics is available for 24 range of income, there are 24 class intervals, we are having serious problem in classifying who might belong to upper income group, middle income group, and so on. So for this purpose, I have drawn the idea from GNA per capita income of the World Bank. Now, this is the second column. It tells you what is the GNA per capita income for classifying the countries into lower income, middle income, and high income in 2022. Then I have, since these are all adjusted for inflation, then I try to find what is the equivalence of that, so that I can actually hit on the exact range of income from which onwards I can consider the individuals as if they belong to high income or middle income and so on, right? For this categorization purpose, I am actually using this analytical classification of World Bank, and then I find that in 2023, individuals earning more than 10 lakh, they can be considered as high income, and middle income from 3 lakh and 50,000 to 10 lakh, and so on. Right, and we have generally considered those who are not filed the tax returns as belonging to low income. Now, since this GNA per capita classification is adjusted for inflation, we also try to adjust for inflation going back to 2011-12, which is the starting period for us. So you see that this is how we have actually considered back in 2011-12, right, upper income as if they belong to a group up to 2,50,000. Now, you might ask whether it is appropriate for us to do it. My answer is yes. I am drawing support from 2 major studies. One was done way back in 1962 by Oja and Butt, Dr. Butt. And what they did was, they also assumed that those who had not filed, based on 53-54 tax return, they also assumed that those who had not filed tax returns, they belong to lower class, and up to from 3,000 to 25,000, it's a big category, they consider as middle class, right? And 25,000 onwards, they consider as upper income group. Now, what I did was, using the GDP deflator, I had adjusted this 3,000 to arrive at what will be its equivalent in 2020 to 23. Then I arrived somewhere around to 1,50,000, which is an exemption limit. Right, when some individuals are within that exemption limit, they wouldn't actually file the tax return. So it is actually, I can draw some support. Then, based on 1967, the doyen of Indian National Account Statistics, Dr. Mukherjee, he had written a paper in EPW where he said upper group should belong to 25,000 and above. Now that 25,000 and above, when I actually add it, then I find that it is also hitting the 10 lakh. So based on that, what I have done is I have actually classified the income band and number of tax returns. Probably we'll concentrate on, you'll find that as percentage of GDP, the total amount of income as declared has actually, from the high income group, has gone up from 4.3% to 10.7% in 2022-23. But as percentage of population, this high income group had accounted for 0.1%, but in 2022-23 they account for 1%. So which means 1% of the population accounts for 10.7%. At the same time, if you combine upper middle with higher class, then you will find that 0.1 and 6, 0.6, that is 0.7% of the population had accounted for almost 63% of the total income. But now this percentage has gone up to 4.5% and they account for something like 85% or more of the total income filed. Right, and in the I have given the split of this income by three major categories: salary income, business income, and other income. The major highlight, as you can see, it is this there is a huge shift in the salary income. This is a very important observation I am making, because in the morning we are talking about labor share and all that. I have a point on that. So this point also comes out very clearly here. Look at the salary income of the upper high income. Though 0.1% of the upper income, they are the one who filed the tax returns, accounting for 37.3% of the total salaries in the economy. Now this 0.1 has become 0.7, there is a high rise, but they account for 59.3%. So which means the salary income, whatever the income tax guys are collecting, they are all actually increasingly accounted by upper income. At the same time, if you look at middle income, 3-4 minutes, right? Middle income, okay, middle income, then you will find that it is the middle, upper middle who are actually paying more of business income, right? Then I'll just skip this slide. I'll come to this is more substantial slide. Now what do I do is I take compensation to employees. This we normally say is in the morning Geeta-san was talking about factor income, and factor income to labor is in the national account statistics. It is captured by means of compensation to employees. So since salary is part of compensation to employees, what I try to do is I have tried to distribute the compensation to employees in terms of lower income, lower middle, and all these income categorization. You will find that if you look at the total, right, as percentage of net value added, which is nothing but net domestic product of the earlier NAS series. Now the CE now accounts for 41%, whereas in 2011-2 they accounted for 37%. That means labor share has gone up. But then who is actually gaining more out of this labor share? Now look at the as percentage of the total, who is gaining? Now high income class used to account for 8.8%. Now they account for 23.3%, whereas lower income share has come down. So as we talk about the distribution of compensation to employees, it's very clear that there is a clear-cut evidence that it is more of share that goes to high income, and therefore there is also labor market dynamics, etc. And in some of the subsequent slides where I have worked out the total earnings in the system and distributed across different social groups, and what I have noticed is the proportionate share of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, right, they are comparatively lower as compared to their share in the total population. And this order, right, the scheduled tribe, yes sir, one more, last minute, right, scheduled tribe, right, they have relatively lesser share, whether you take the total earnings in the system or assets or consumption. That's what the remaining slides actually will show, right? They have lesser share compared to the population, and similarly scheduled caste also have lesser share. Then comes OBC, and in all these the other categories have overwhelming share compared to their population share. So that is the, I mean, these are all something which is the which is what we observe with respect to certain this economic variables. Now, Atkinson, who is writing quite a lot on this income inequality, and he has also co-authored a few papers with Piketty, and what he says is economic outcomes are determined by two major variables. One is circumstances, that is the background of the person. Second one is effort, that which can be associated with an individual. Now, I mean, I have not shown one slide about the wage differentials, which Kannan and Ravindran had been talking about, right? We also have some evidence to show that there is little incentive for the lower caste to move upward. Not only they don't find the job, but if you look in terms of wage differential, after all, right, what you get in the formal employment should be so attractive for you to move out of informal employment. But that is not the case with the lower, what we call the social groups like SC, ST, and to some extent OBC. So they are stuck up in casual labor, right? And casual labor is the low-paying job, and we have the evidence on that. And if you see the order in which SC populations are engaged, if I take again as proportionate share, you will find that they are stuck up with casual labor, then they are employed more in the self-employment, then they are employed more in the formal employment. Whereas when you talk about others, right, then you see the reverse. And in terms of which employment is paying more, then it is the regular job, which is paying 2 times more than the job that you get in the casual employment. So therefore, we find that there is a labor market dynamics which actually mediates the inequality, and this inequality is tend to perpetuate, right, already, which is a depressive social institution. And we'll conclude here. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Dennis, for that very fascinating presentation. I forgot to mention that due to unforeseen circumstances, Vijay Bhaskar couldn't join us here. May I call upon Professor Krishna Kumar to offer his comments.
It was indeed enriching reading this particular paper on inequalities by Dennis Rajkumar and Vijay Bhaskar. And as exhaustive, it's very reflective from the part that the person himself could not complete the presentation. It has many details. It stands out. Particularly important as what I saw is this particular issue with respect to the salary income when it increases from 7.2% to 13.1%. The salary income which accrues to the higher income groups increases from 2.7% to 7.5%, which means that for the time period which Dennis Rajkumar and his co-author makes a presentation, the share of the higher income groups in the salary income increases from 37.5% to 57.25%, which brings us to the sort of questions which Stephen Marglin and others had raised long back as to what do the bosses do, which means there's a small echelon up over there who gets the cream out of this sort of increases, because studies, even in United States economy, studies were essentially trying to exclude this group and calculate the median wage income. It was found to be in real terms stagnating. And yet another important issue which I found to stand out in this particular paper is with respect to the focus they have given. Of course, he could not deal at length with this, but nonetheless, they have given with respect to the different social groups as well as the assets, as well as the social groups, and the way in which their earnings, I'm not sure whether it's for the same job the earnings are being referred to as lower compared to their counterparts. But that said, may I also make certain queries as a person who read the paper, and certain queries which I have to Professor Dennis Rajkumar are these. One is, even when we say that between 2011-12 and 2022-24, there has been such a big upswing with respect to the salaries of the higher incomes as against the salaries of the non-higher income groups. There has been a big upswing, 57% it has increased. Despite the increase occurring between 2011-12 and 2022-23 in this regard, the Gini coefficient, however, remains from 0.474. In fact, it declines to 0.465. I do not know whether that statistical possibility is there. Might be it is there, but then if it is there, then I would say possibly this well-entrenched system of higher groups or higher echelons of the labor force in our country, cornering a larger chunk was not something which is an outcome of the 2011-12 plus period. Might be, it could be traced back further back. That is, might be, if the data is available for a period back, might be this is a long-term, what one could usually refer to as some sort of a reality to which we have come to. And number two is purely analytical. For example, they have a very different analytical methodology of classification. I'll just take only 2 minutes. And that analytical methodology of classification is higher income countries have got a GNI per capita, which is around $13,845, and you multiply it by the exchange rates of 2011-12 as well as with respect to 2022-23. In fact, there I really think that when I had multiplied 13,845 with the exchange rate of 47.9 as well as with respect to 80.65, the numbers are tallying and they have appropriately fixed it. But the problem is that we have to multiply it with the GNI per capita declared by the World Bank for 2011-12, multiply it by that exchange rate, and again 2022-23, they should multiply it by that exchange rate. Then might be the numbers would be a little bit different, because here what happens is that we will try to be saying much of this increases in income and much of this inequalities in income could also be attributed to huge changes with respect to exchange rate alone, because we are now keeping the 13,000, at least for the higher income groups I have cross-checked, I do not know about the others, or I do not know whether there is an inadvertent error which has crept in. I would like you to clarify that. And number two is that inequality studies, it is very good that we are focusing on inequality studies within our country, because it is staring, it is glaring, it is actually staring at us in a very bad way. But we should not forget the fact that the inequality studies, which are this genre of Piketty and followed by Piketty, number of other studies, or even before Piketty studies, Vamshi Vakilabranam and others have done a lot of studies in our country, Professor Kannan and Ravindra, all these sorts of studies which have come are trying to address the question of inequalities within our country. But we should also know that in the international sphere, there is yet another set of studies which are led by Branko, Milanovic and others, which tries to say that there is a curve called the elephant curve, and in that curve called the elephant curve, you have global inequalities reducing because the incomes of the deciles to which the middle classes of China, India, Brazil and all these East Asian countries have been on the increase, and their share has been increasing. So something like we are contributing to the reduction of global inequality by increases in the incomes of the upper middle, lower middle and upper middle classes of these developing countries there. And on the other hand, the fallout of that is showing up in the form of rising inequalities within our country, and it was a great pleasure of a treasure reading Dennis Rajkumar's paper.
Thank you, Professor Krishna Kumar. May I now call upon Srijit Mishra to make his presentation.
Visible? So this is moving. How will this move? Okay. Thank you, Professor Raman, and thank you for inviting me, because CDS has a lot of nostalgic memories and moments. We were talking about how now Dennis and the discussant were talking about how we will be addressing how difficult it is to measure who the rich are and how their incomes are. So now I will be getting into who the poor are and how to measure them, and maybe this could be a technical presentation on the work of, or a critical look into what Alkire and Foster have worked in their multidimensional index. But people, those who have worked into the measurement of poverty are familiar with the Foster method. And what Foster now joins with Al-Qaeda and tells that the poverty measure that we are doing with income, can that be extended to multiple dimensions? So in this, like suppose M is that multidimensional index, and we have individuals from 1 to N and dimensions from 1 to D. So a weighted index of the gap. What is this gap? The gap is nothing like if you are familiar with the poverty index, FGT. So your poverty minus your actual income divided by poverty gives us a normalized measure, normalized poverty score, or normalized in 1 dimensions. So we extend that to each and every dimension, and so a particular individual, a particular individual's particular dimensions get a score of Wij, which if we give equal weight to each and every individual and we give equal weight to each and every dimension, that will look by 1 by ND, N times D. So is it moving? Okay. So keeping this measure in mind, so what we did is, we did a talismanic exercise to a group of students and asked them, what would you consider to be dimensions to understand vulnerability or deprivation for, let us say, research scholars? And so one dimension they identified is income, or it could be a fellowship that the student gets, and how they are progressing in their educational thinking journey. What is their health status? It could include both mental and physical health. And do they have access to resources, including library and other things? So drawing from Gandhiji, I gave them that, okay, imagine a student whom you think could be a vulnerable student and give scores on these dimensions. And the students only identified, okay, income could be in rupees, education progress could be satisfactory or not satisfactory, and health status could be reasonably healthy, somewhat unhealthy, and not healthy. Similarly, access to resources it exceeds your expectation, meets expectation, near your expectation, or below expectation, or your university institute has no resources. So then they gave scores about this individual that they have in mind, and these are raw scores which we are showing, and for each of these raw score, like for example, the first cell is 5,000 rupees, and our income poverty line for that is 15,000 rupees. So it is, your Z is 15, actual income is 5, so 15 minus 5 divided by 15 will give you 0.67. So these cells, the numbers in the first 4 columns are the first, after UID the next 4 columns is giving you what are the normalized scores. So 0 means that you don't have anything, and 1 means that you have, the other way round. So the 1 means that you are poor in that, 0 means you are not poor. So now the Al-Qaeda Foster measure is actually, it's a very, the first part of their exercise I think is a very good exercise, where they are trying to bring in poverty by bringing in multiple dimensions, and some dimensions can be continuous, like your income we have used. Some dimensions can be binary, like the education progress we have used here. The others, like health and access, could be categorical, more than 2 categorical. So that's a very, and bringing them, and because of the normalization Z minus Xi by Z that they have done, which means that you take away the unit of measurement of each dimension and you can add and subtract that you do. So this part is actually very good exercise, and then they try to understand poverty. Suppose it would be head count. So that means wherever we have positive numbers, that dimension, that individual is poor. Wherever in the income, education, health and access columns, wherever you have positive dimensions, that individual is poor in that dimension, otherwise they are non-poor. Now the union approach says that if you are poor in any of the dimensions, you will be considered poor. The U, the next deprivation that I put as U. The intersection says that only when you are poor in all the dimensions, then only you will be considered as poor. So then they say that if you take the union approach, in the head count sense, it may give us a very high incidence of poverty. On the other hand, if you take an intersection approach, we may get a very low measure of poverty. Now, they then come up with something called, okay, only when someone is poor in 3 dimensions or something that called K, then only we will consider that as poor. Now, I think the problem lies here. See, they actually gave a measure which is not about head count, which is because every dimension, if a particular individual is poor in 1 dimension, and here we have 4 dimensions, then that individual is poor, or the measure will give you only 1/4. It will not be 1. Head count gives you a value of 1, but if I'm poor in only 1 dimension, it is 1/4. So going to head count and then coming to a public policy decision that remove these, like suppose someone doesn't have a house or someone doesn't have access to something, you remove that person from that poor. So if the institute, suppose let us say these are PhD scholars, not necessarily in CDS, and if they are poor in 2 dimensions, we certainly remove them from poverty and then say, no, this institution will not require any intervention to facilitate their PhD journey. So that, but those 2 dimensions, people were poor, and most of the students in that institute were poor in that dimension, so that should have been addressed. So I think what is happening here, there is an information loss that is happening, and we need to answer that. Why is that information loss happening? This is happening because of the censoring. You said that, okay, only when someone is poor in 3 dimensions, then only we will capture that individual, otherwise that individual will be considered as non-poor. Now, this, the first set of numbers are saying that when you don't do censoring, and the second set of numbers are when you do censoring. Like many individuals who were earlier poor in that dimension have now become 0 because we have removed them from being considered as poor. Only you have poor in 3 dimensions, then only we will consider. So now just come to the last 2 rows. That is where I will be bringing my analysis. So if you look at the last 2 rows, each of the columns that you see is actually like from M1J, if you compare with M1 given C, given censoring. So 0.62 is the deprivation, aggregate deprivation for that dimension that we are getting for all the individuals. If I do censoring, I am getting only 0.02. So the censoring reduces the vulnerability that could come in each dimensions. So now so what is it? This is because of the head count fetish. So there is an information loss in multidimensional index of deprivation on account of this censoring. Why is this happening? Because the gap of censoring will be lower than the gap without censoring. Now, then you may question, okay, what you are talking about, the problem of censoring across dimensions can also hold good within a dimension. Poverty line is also censoring. In a sense, yes, poverty line is also censoring. Now the point is that particularly these 4, I will restrict myself to these 4 dimensions that I was talking about. The talismanic exercise gave the students, okay, these are the various sets of vulnerability, but someone pointed out 25,000 could be also a vulnerable point of income. So if, or 25,000 is the highest, so anything below 25,000 could be vulnerable. Okay, if 25,000 is non-poor in income dimension and anything below 25,000 is poor, then should we not capture the others? That person is non-poor in that direction. Should we not capture the others? Similarly, if someone's education progress is satisfactory, not satisfactory, that is clear. But when you come to health, so we said reasonably healthy and somewhat healthy. So if I put the poverty line or the deprivation line at somewhat healthy, but there is a difference between reasonably healthy and somewhat healthy, are we missing that? Should we not capture that? So I'm not trying to bring in the case for poverty line being relevant or not relevant. There are literature elsewhere, but I'm saying that there is an information loss that is coming out here, and this can also be captured. These 2 sets of information loss are more or less similar. They both, what will they do? They will reduce your measure of poverty. See, if we correct the Niti Aayog's multidimensional index, then we could get a higher value which they are missing out. Now, 5 moments, no? You want me to summarize? Sure. Okay, because my batchmate took more time, I have to reduce my time. Okay, but I have been doing that. No, fair enough. So there can be information loss. I'll finish it in 3 minutes.
I'll take care. So the kind of information loss in multidimensional index of deprivation on account of dimension-specific deprivation lines. Anyway, so now I'm bringing in a different kind of deprivation. Now, let us go back to the health measure. Reasonably healthy, somewhat unhealthy, very unhealthy. Suppose these are 4 categories that we have done, 3, 2, 1, 0. Now, I said that, okay, and many times when we do indexing, we'll say, okay, reasonably healthy and somewhat healthy, we'll give them 1, and both unhealthy categories, I'll give them 0. That means I convert a category data that I have collected into a binary data. So now what will this do? So this is my third, the V3. So you just look at that column, V3 in the first set and V3 in the next set. So and look at only one row, U1. So what is happening? V3 under U1 in the first set, it is giving you a value of 0.25. That means if someone is poor there, that person is poor in that dimension, and each dimension has 1/4 score. So this 0.025 is giving you that. Okay. Now, but I have removed the variability because there is 3, 2, 1, and 0. I have removed that variability. So if I want to capture that variability, that is captured in the second set, V3 again. If you look at the third column, V3 column, you will see that the numbers are different. So what is happening here? Here, this binary can give you a higher measure. So, but the point is, okay, there you are talking about lower measure, here you are talking about higher measure. The point is there is information loss. There was variability in the data. I have thrown that out. Now, so the binary specification can also not be of help, particularly in those cases when particularly scholars who go to the field collect data, and while collecting data you did a categorical thinking, but then when you come to analysis you throw away that. If that is not relevant, why do you go and waste your time and respondents' time in collecting data? Collect binary data itself. Are you healthy, not healthy? That would do. So the point of information loss also has other implications and survey costs and thing. So there is, and all this exercise, the multidimensional index of poverty is like, if you take, suppose this is Al-Qaeda and all, they have also used the same method to come up with an empowerment index. So what is empowerment? Like E is equal to 1 minus M, the M that we began with will be empowerment. So it is a attainment kind of indicator. So, okay, I have covered my 3 minutes, so I'm summing up. So this I have already told you. So what are the lessons that we take? First thing is that Al-Qaeda Foster begin with this weighted index, but having done an exercise that we can go from one dimension, income dimension, to multiple dimension, which need not be income also, which can have categorical and binary and continuous data can be together. They throw the baby with the bathwater by bringing in first censoring. The deprivation line is not a comment on them. Deprivation line is rather a comment of when we are doing research, and we should be consistent when we motivate for field or collection of data and then analysis. But if you are analyzing someone else's data, then you need to justify why you need to bring in a deprivation line or not bring in a deprivation line. And in the same vein, why, if you collect data, at that stage you should decide, should it be binary, should it be categorical? At analysis stage, if it is someone else's data, it needs to be substantially justified. Now, particularly, if you are students nowadays actually use all this kind of secondary data available to generate an index. Now, if you are generating an index, I would say use the entire data that is available for converting it to an index. See, because otherwise your econometric analysis will have a dependent variable, whether it is in your dependent variable or independent variable. The more information that, see, when you are converting n-dimensional into a single dimension, there is loss of information. There is no doubt about that. But why do you want to have additional loss of information over that? I think Professor Kelke is there. So I don't want to delve into the econometric aspect of it, but this will have implications on, say, information is there with you and you are not using it. So scholars, those who want to convert index from whatever data that you are collecting, not only multidimensional index, if there's any multidimensional, any other index that you are converting, try to see that whatever information is there, don't lose it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Srijit. A very fascinating presentation. May I call upon Professor Mishra to offer his comments. Make it brief.
Thank you, Professor Raman. And at the outset, let me thank CDS and Director CDS to have brought me for this momentous occasion to be a part of it. In fact, I must tell that these papers were really organized with very interesting themes and very contemporary relevance. But I must start with one thing, that actually what we leave and go into other, we get into more complication. 60s poverty debate could not be resolved, so we went to multi-dimensional poverty. Poverty debate still remains in the place. So when in fact, whatever little engagement I have a lot of familiarity with Professor Srijit's work for a long time now. I think that information loss, which is trying to focus on, is a very well-known fact. When you index something, you actually lose information. But here, the issue is not about merely information loss. It's basically about knowing the difference between how many to which one. And this is the question which should have engaged multidimensional index methodology builders. Also, with all due respect to Sabina Alkere, I will put her work in a controversy between two words: simplicity outweighing adequacy. This simplicity is not acceptable, which outweighs adequacy of a measure. Having said that, I feel that there is a lot of thinking process which is coming because of this kind of methodology being developed, is that a lot of thinking is going toward thinking binaries. Thinking binaries, dichotomy, has actually also a component of loss of information. And this loss of information, as Professor Srijit highlights, I have a lot of work which I have done in this regard, where I feel that why we do not want to go for a continuous scoring. Why are still binaries so useful, binaries so lovely to look at it? In fact, binaries are not harmful, provided you know how to examine binaries. Binaries can be examined with conditionality against each other. Binaries can be examined in terms of association between each other. That's fine. But measurement of binaries with dichotomy is the most harmful thing that can happen to measure deprivation per se. This is my fulsome conclusion on it. Binaries can never resolve it. Coming to the fact that any index, now you know, for all of you I must say that we have reached a time today that we get 365 index or more than that in a year. And one of the things which perhaps people do not even say is that index has a purpose. It started, this DG started with the advent of Human Development Index, in fact. And till date, people celebrate Human Development Index. But I must tell you one thing, that Human Development Index had a very narrow purpose. It had a purpose just to compare, just to rank. Tell me what is the meaning of 0.638 in interpretation? So if we make a measure, its interpretative value is more important. It had a purpose to rank, it had a purpose to position, perfectly fine. So I said this for one reason, that multidimensional index or anything, any kind of index definitely loses information, fascinates people to rank things. And in fact, this exercise what Professor Srijit wants exposed in this paper is very vital for young scholars to understand. If you lose information, are you adding something else? You lose information and the process is fine. Are you adding something else? The purpose is finally to rank. Purpose is finally to say that this district has that. And this state is ranked as multidimensional. And in fact, multidimensional head count is another damage. Because of the fact that this head count facilitates a number which government wants. Very simple. I have a simple answer. Government wants a number which multidimensional poverty number facilitates. In summary, I would say that my statement, please move away from normatives and please move away from binaries to make any kind of scientific advances in knowledge. And in fact, this binary thinking will reduce us to develop many more indexes of no purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And since we've already overstretched, I think we'll wind up now and proceed for lunch. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Dennis. Thank you, Professor Srijit Mishra, Professor Krishna Kumar, and Professor Mishra. Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll throw it open for Sorry. 5 minutes, a few questions here. Sorry. Sorry.
Dennis, I have one question. Okay, I have one question to Dennis. It was an excellent paper. He has rightly started his paper saying that billion or colonial Raj is replaced by billion Raj. But then after that, you didn't really touch upon that aspect of your paper. Maybe in the paper detail you might have given, but it would be interesting to reflect on that part of your paper, especially when you found that business income, share of business income is declining while income from the employees are increasing. Why is it so? Is there no any implications to talk about? So is there any way to collect income from this business class? What is your take on increasing the corporate tax in this regime? Thank you.
Quick question for Srijit and the two Mishras. Thanks for doing this, because I've been so frustrated with this multidimensional index for too long. So this, I think, does a great job. The one thing, however, is that why do we keep going towards this binary? And it clearly comes from a policy interest. We need to know who is poor, who is not poor. Easiest way of doing this is do a binary of some kind. I think if we were to focus on how it is possible to get a better statistical way of ending up with that binary of who is poor and who is not poor, because it's not so much a question of who is poor and who is not poor, but how poor is somebody. And that takes us away from the binary. But it may make policy more complex, because you can't have simple give ration cards to this bunch and not to the others. How much do you give to whom becomes the question.
A very quick question to Dennis. In your classification that you use from World Bank incomes, did you use the purchasing power parity? Did you account for that? Because then you're not comparing equal the basket of goods, right?
Yeah. Can I ask? So my question is to Professor Srijit. You know, when you in a multidimensional poverty construction, when you combine objective indicator like income with a set of subjective indicators, don't you face the problem of interpersonal comparisons? You know, because then your thresholds for different individuals are also shaped by their level of aspiration. So this is question one, because that affects the first cutoff points, right? You know, how do you decide the first set of cutoff points? And yes, the health status. Yeah. No, health status, progress. Was it not subjective? You don't ask the students? Yeah. And second is, when you use the word vulnerability as a substitute of, deprivation, there is a problem, because vulnerability in poverty economics literature is very clearly defined as a, ex ante measure of the probability of poverty at T plus K, where K is something positive. Yeah.
Just a few more questions.
This is to Krishnamurthy, sir. Sir, you mentioned about the paradox of the elephant curve. Even so, the world inequality is diminishing. The intra-inequality inside India and China are galloping. What could be the reason for such a paradox of elephant curve?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Krishna Kumar. I will take some of your suggestions on board when we improve upon this paper. Right. Your question, which I will also relate to what Madhuri had asked. See, I have to take market exchange, right? Because there are a lot of issues using the PPP. And similarly, World Bank always adjusts for inflation, all that, that analytical cutoffs, only using the market exchange rate, although it is a weighted index, right? So I just took the market exchange rate. That's the reason. Bina, I will talk to you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think, see, yes, policy making is a complex exercise, but in this case, if I have shortfalls in one dimension, I'll address that. There I'll get a 1-0, so it's not a problem. So just, why do you want to bother about 1-0 at the aggregate level? So at policy level, and there are other work, both he and I, we have done how to make measures policy sensitive, but that is a separate thing. No, this is not interpersonal problem. This could be interdimensional problem. But like the HDI measure, what we do, actual minus minimum by max minus minimum, and that normalizes where it takes away the unit. So Z minus Xij by Z also takes away your unit. So it's not no more. You can make mathematical manipulations like addition and all. But yeah. Again, coming back, if you want to relate it to policies and other things, we should be contextual and we should not just look at the numbers. Yeah, that's the emotional part of the numbers should not be left out. Well, vulnerability, you can say that, okay, sometimes we economists assume while we are speaking. So take that away. When I was referring to vulnerability, I was not referring in the sense that you understand or you speak. So maybe that was a slip of my tongue. So you consider that to be deprivation. That point is fair and well taken.
Yes, I'm just addressing Geeta's concern, particularly about this binary. In fact, I'm reminded of a keynote talk recently I gave with a very attractive title called Avoiding Binaries and Embracing the Continuum. Because in fact, that is one of the most important things in the scientific community to be spread. But I must tell that it is not that construction of binaries has only the issue of identification. Construction of binary has an implication for aggregation as well, because we have to give a measure ultimately, and also identification part is conditioned by the binary, which actually, as you say, there will be conflict whether it is there or not. But having a consistent binary identification requires the kind of terms and the kind of properties which you take, this criteria or that criteria, any number of criteria. It's important that which criteria for whom, that's important. And that which criteria for whom is not easily acceptable for government or policymakers. Therefore, this identification has always been an issue, will remain an issue. To make it consistent will be a bigger challenge. However, I think that binary is not the way out. That's why I title my saying that please embrace the continuum. It is your choice to make the normative when you have the continuum. Thank you.
Query raised on this question of global inequality. The issue is this, that from 80s to 2010, in the curve which he charts, he says that there is this top decile, that is the people, the rich in United States, New Zealand and Europe. Their relative shares has increased. But the working middle classes in United States as well as in North America and Europe, it has gone down. And then there is this group of middle income countries, of which the upper middle class to rich, in countries like India, China, Brazil and others, which has gone up. So of course, when a lower income group and the other people, their incomes are relatively stagnant of sorts. So one amongst these two continental economies, they're growing and the incomes going up, is resulting in the reduction of global inequality is what Branko Milanovic says. That does not in any way excuse us from addressing the question of internal inequalities, be it in India or in United States or for that matter any part. It's not making a case against inequality. I was drawing attention that that inequality worldwide, we are actually contributing to the reduction of inequality. But how are we going to share it within our country should also be a question which we should be addressing. Okay, thank you so much for the query.
Yeah, with that we'll wind up. I'm sorry, I wish we had more time to continue the discussion. May I once again thank Dr. Dennis Rajkumar, Professor Srijit Mishra, Professor Krishna Kumar, and Professor Mishra for what was a very stimulating session. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, respected members of the session. Now we can break for lunch. Please come back by 2 p.m. We're all running late by 40 minutes. So let's count up the time and lunch is in Shamiana. Thank you.